שהטרוריסטים הבזים לדם ילדיהם לא יחוסו על דם ילדינו.
איננו ממהרים לשום מקום, יש לנו סבלנות, יש לנו אורך נשימה.
ليس هناك ما تخشاه المقاومة الفلسطينية التي تمارس مقاومة مشروعة مارستها كل الشعوب التي تعرضت للاحتلال.
חמאס משלם ועוד ישלם מחירים כבדים על הפשעים הללו שהוא מבצע.
Hello and welcome to I-24 News here in our special edition coverage, day 48 of Operation Protective Edge, a conflict now between Israel and Hamas. Well, now the two are treading a fine line between renewed escalation and heading back to the negotiating table in Cairo. The stream of rockets being fired on Israeli communities is heavy. Nearly 700 have been launched since the last truce was broken just this last Tuesday afternoon. Well, 4 Israeli civilians were injured by mortars fired at the northern Gaza Strip's border crossing with Israel today. And reportedly, at least 12 people were killed from an Israeli strike inside Gaza. Well, Israel's northern border entered the equation over the weekend with rockets now fired from Lebanon and Syria. Also, Israel Defense Force units have now continued their strikes and pounding targets in the Strip, including Mohammed al-Ul, the man responsible for the financial transactions of Hamas. But at the same time, the diplomatic picture could be changing, with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas announcing he'll present a new surprising plan with wide Arab support. Well, as always, we'll go to our correspondents in the field. Well, joining us from the field now, we have our correspondents at the Gaza border, Sami Abu Diab, Leo Bardugo, and Shai Ben-Ari, representing our Arabic, French, and English channels. Now, we also have a team up on the northern border here, Hisham Farid, Maxime Perez, and Shahab Peled. We will be joined by other correspondents as well in the Israeli city of Ashkelon, standing by to update us on the situation. Well, now joining me in the studio now is Yoav Limor, military analyst here for us, and former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Yitzhak Levanon. Thank you both for joining us on this special edition. But we'll be back with our guests in just a moment. Now we go to our correspondent, Shai Ben-Ari, who's standing by now on the Gaza border with Israel. Excuse me, Shai, can you update us on what's the status of events down there now?
Yes, David. Well, we're basically talking about a very dangerous situation that continues along this border, the Israel-Gaza border, where over the past few days and today as well, we're seeing something of a focus from the side of Hamas on mortar shell fire. We've seen and heard a number of mortar shells falling not far from us. Basically, we heard basically a color red alert. I'm being told that right now we could actually see 2 launches, apparently. This is, a live event, of course, and this is a situation that exists here in this area. We'll try to bring you those pictures if we see something definitive. You may have heard that. That was probably a mortar shell landing not far from here. But this is a situation that exists right now along this border, and it's become a reality, really. People here, of course, are very worried about the situation. A lot of people in the communities surrounding us don't often know exactly what to do. Many of them have left the area, but there were statements made by government and army officials earlier that led them to believe that they could actually return, and now they are sort of stuck in limbo, so to speak. A lot of them don't know exactly what to do, and it could be said that the government has been somewhat unclear on this message about what exactly is expected of the residents of this area regarding their lives, the routine of life that is expected for them here in this area, and they want answers. Really, that is a situation that exists here on the Israel-Gaza border.
Shai, now we can tell you're speaking to some people around you in the area. There are these other correspondents now who are out in these areas, or are these residents, Israelis, who are basically coming out there to see what's going on?
Well, I would say that, you don't see a lot of residents actually coming out and staying out in the field. They've gotten used to it. It's no longer that much of an attraction. Not the scenes that we were seeing earlier in the earlier stages of this conflict, where people, were watching the bombardments of the Israeli Air Force in Gaza. That is less what is going on now. There's still somewhat of a presence of reporters in this area, but less certainly in terms of the international media, less intensive reporting, I would say, in this area. But of course, that does not have anything to do with the situation, which continues. And I'm hearing right now, I think, either bombardments or mortar shells falling not far from here. Basically, the situation continues, and it often does, of course, pick up into the night and heat up sort of as we near midnight. It's still a very young night right now.
You can tell that the action taking place not far from you here, as you're talking about hearing the sounds of potentially falling mortar shells as well. Is there any discernible civilian activity in the area? Are people still commuting to and from work? Is life continuing at all in these regions?
Yes, that is a surreal reality that does continue in this region. Basically, life does go on even under these conditions. We're talking about, for example, gas stations that are open with their employees coming to work every day, even in these very difficult and dangerous conditions. We were speaking with someone who was basically telling us about his ongoing frustrations with the salary he was earning. People still have to worry about the mundane, everyday things that bother them day to day. Basically, it's interesting to hear the perspective of local residents. They basically have become accustomed to these conditions surrounding them, and they often just focus on the more mundane details of life. That is just the reality here.
Well, thank you very much, Shai Ben-Ari, our correspondent, standing by on the border now between Israel and the Gaza Strip. We'll come back to him for more live updates throughout the edition now. Well, we're also joined in the studio now by our third guest, Lior Ackerman, a former senior officer of the Israeli security agency, the Shin Bet. Thank you for joining us here as well. Yoav, let's start by talking about the military updates in the situation now. What's taking place this weekend? What's the most significant development of today?
It seems like both sides are being in their posts, not giving up anything, but not going anywhere at the moment. I mean, if one could expect that after what we've seen in the weekend, Israel will go forward, send some units, boots on the ground, it doesn't happen so far. I very much suspect that it will happen today or tomorrow. Israel anticipates the renewal of talks in Cairo within a few days. You'll talk about it probably with the ambassador in a few minutes. There are no hints of renewal of those talks, but in the background, there are rumors, there are talks between Israelis and Egyptians, between Palestinians and Egyptians.
You think this is affecting the fighting on the ground?
It doesn't affect directly, but indirectly, it makes both sides going to get into a point that each side is trying to gain as many points as possible before the final whistle is being blown. So you see the Israelis trying to make as many targeted killings as possible in Gaza by at the same time avoiding killing as many civilians as possible and keeping a strong defense. We've seen the 4-year-old child getting killed on Friday. Israel pulled out some children, some women in order to prevent more civilians getting killed. On the Palestinian side, you see them putting a barrage of rockets on the kibbutzim and towns surrounding Gaza in order to put pressure on them, trying to get the population, the civil population, put pressure on the government in order to get the Israeli government give something to the Palestinians in the talks in Cairo. So both sides are trying to get some.
For now, it's about repositioning each side at the table.
Each time is in its own position. Currently, nothing changes, and we're talking about 48 days, the longest war in Israel's history after the independence war. That's some event.
And the first Lebanese war, I believe, was also lasted for a longer time.
Not the official. It took over for 18 years, but the official one was shorter than 48 days.
The war of attrition as well, could be argued, but not taking anything away from the fact this is a long campaign, and definitely highlights an important aspect of this. As this campaign lengthens, Ambassador Lebanon, How does that change? As you have just mentioned now, all the recent moves seem to be repositioning each side for the next round at the table. Do you see it that way as well, that this is just, again, a dance, a prelude to the next round of negotiations, or is there something more substantial taking
Definitely,
place?
yes. This is a prelude to the talks which will be open, I don't know when, but soon in Cairo, because I think that there is an interest by all the parties to go back to the table of negotiations in Cairo. Cairo is ready for that. Cairo is in touch with both sides. Cairo is in touch with Americans. I think that there are other initiatives, but most of the people in the region, and more specifically, let's say the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas and Israel, are keen to see only Egypt playing that role and less, let's say, the others, not the Jordanian or the Security Council, probably to complement what Egypt is doing. So I believe that what's going on in these days is, each one is trying to score more points before going to Cairo and present their demands. There's one point which seems to be very interesting, is that for the first time, I hear in Egypt that President Sisi is not talking about a limited ad hoc solution. For the first time, he is talking about a broad solution, meaning the two-state solution within the efforts to bring everybody to the table on
make this conflict and the talks surrounding it part of a greater conversation.
Let's say that he would like to bring, let's say, the first steps toward the bigger picture, which is the two-state solutions between Palestinians and Israelis, and he would like to be there also. So,
do you believe that's a good move on the part of the Egyptians, or is that biting off more than they could chew at this point? Would you?
I think personally it is premature, because we have to solve first the situation, what's going on in Gaza. Look, you still have, this is what Mahmoud Abbas say, first of all, we have to cease the fire. Secondly, we have to rehabilitate, to restore Gaza. They need a lot of effort, to restore all the destructions, and only later on, they will sit down and discuss this issue. And when they will sit down to discuss the issue is the conditions that Israel is putting to have security for the residents and the citizens of Israel. And only later on, we will touch the broader picture, which is the two-state solution.
What do you make of this announcement now by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas about a surprising new initiative, a new plan?
Well, I don't know why he did it. He did it for the TV, the Egyptian TV. He was extremely enigmatic. He said that this is going to be a non-traditional initiative. I don't know what's the meaning of a non-traditional initiative. Is it an initiative? And secondly, he says, I don't know, he was slightly, joking that he's not going to declare war to Israel, as if by declaring war, he's going to solve the situation. We have to wait until next week and see what is.
One remark about that. There was a message yesterday, a public message by the Saudi foreign minister, and I might connect all of that. We might see a renewal of the Arab suggestion that was taken 10 years ago, maybe with the UN resolution that calls on both sides to stop the war and Israel and the Palestinians to renew peace talks. Something
but
about that.
This is not non-traditional. It is traditional, okay.
Obviously.
Let's wait and see.
Let's talk about now. We have discerned a shift in strategy, or at least a shift in tactical achievements now by Israel in the last week since the ceasefire ended, taking out the targeted killings of Hamas leaders now, as recently as today, the head of their financing. What does that say to you about a shift in strategy now by the Israel Defense Force, or is that, again, maybe a shift in a lapse of strategy on the Hamas part, where there's some sloppy maneuvers that Israel took advantage of, or has there been a shift now in the strategy?
I think it's the second choice. I don't think that anybody changes the strategy, not the Hamas, nor the Israel or the ISA. I think that since the beginning of the operation, the intelligence worked the same as it worked now. I think that all their people were very, very alert during all the operations. So it was very hard to find them under the houses and in the caves. But they're making mistakes because it's very hard to not to do mistakes for a long term.
So you don't believe this was a shift of Israeli security policy?
No, I don't think it's a shift. I think that if they had the opportunity and the ability to do it from the beginning, they probably would do it. Now there is a possibility, and I hope that they will use it.
Does this change, in your opinion, does this change the position of Hamas now in terms of the strategical equation? Do they need to respond with new activity of their own?
I think that on the ground it will cause the Hamas a few problems because they need to organize themselves. If Mohammed Deif indeed is gone and the one who was supposed to come after him is also gone.
Have you seen signs of this disorganization? Have you seen signs of disarray among Hamas now?
I don't know what's happening now in the Hamas, but we know from the past that they have a problem to put a person that will be able to do the same as they did, with the same knowledge, with the same experience, and maybe with the same courage. But I don't think it will affect the operation. It will not affect the motivation of the Hamas, even if they will put someone younger, less experienced, they still go forward. They will not surround. They have a very, very, very a clear target, and it's not negotiation and any political negotiation with Israel.
Well, Yoav, now the prospects being
discussed.
One
remark about that, David. Hamas did one significant mistake, which is very unlike him, and that might prove that there is no one to take decisions. That the public killings of 24 people out in the streets,
executions of collaborators,
executions of so-called collaborators, because we don't know whether they were or not. It seemed like ISIS in Iraq, and it came on the same days of James Foley being killed in Iraq, and all the world talking about that. They did a major mistake, because in the eyes of the world, Europe, Australia, US, obviously, it's parallel. You see the pictures, it seems the same. It's very unlike Hamas. They are very much aware to what the world says about them, and doing that shows signs of panic in the streets and panic in decision making. And one would think that if there is panic in decision making, there is no one taking decisions.
Do you agree with that? From what you've seen, this public display, they've been very careful about what images reach the public throughout this campaign. Hamas has controlled all of this imagery. What do you make of that, the sudden release of these images of executions now publicly?
Look, the Hamas is trying lately to justify what he did, and I fully agree with you. This is a huge mistake. Summary executions. You cannot.
Which has taken place throughout this whole campaign, but this is the first public.
Fine, but this is in public. The way they did it, the sequence, with Foley, and this gives the picture to the whole world, not only in Israel but to the whole world, and nobody can stop, to make the similarity between the IS, the Islamic State, and Hamas. So the last, score points in that regard. But they're trying to justify it because we were under pressure. We didn't know at the beginning. This was before, the war. Now we are executing, etc. All this definitely shows that there are in a kind of a disarray of their own leaders, and this is why some did it and the others are justifying. But definitely they lost a lot of points and score in the public opinion.
In the international public arena.
International, and I think that Israel, we should use it in our favor.
Leo, do you see this in any other way? Is there another way to read this public display of executions? Obviously, there's a fear factor involved. They're there to intimidate their own people from even having ideas of this kind of behavior. But the specific choice of now, releasing these images.
Yes, I think that we are expecting the Hamas to be pragmatic, because we are very pragmatic during this process. But the fact is that the Hamas has its own agenda, which is not so different from the ISIS agenda. It's the same. It's the fundamentalistic Islamic agenda, which want to build a Muslim country all around the Middle East and afterwards in the West and everywhere. It's the same agenda. They're coming from the same wing in the Islam, and they want to get to the same place. So if we are waiting them to be pragmatic and think logically, it will be our mistake. In the second Intifada, 10 years ago and more, they killed more than 2,000 collaborators, so-called, in Judea and Samaria and in
Gaza. And in Gaza as
and
well,
in Gaza,
within their territories. Yeah.
They said, of course, that they were collaborators, but we know now Today we can say that very, very few of them were really collaborators. So I think that the situation today is the same. They're trying to spread fear among the population, the same as the ISIS do.
At the same time, shows their own fear in this witch hunt type of behavior where they're out to
sure that they are fearing because
anyone.
they're afraid. They know that we have our abilities. We know that we have our human resources and technology. They know and they felt it that we can reach them. They know it not from today. They know for years. But I think that they are, even though they're a little bit confused, it's the way of thinking. They will not stop doing it just because the world is waiting them and expecting them to be pragmatic. No.
We'll come back to our guests here in a moment. Right now, we're joined on the line from the Gaza Strip by Dr. Hani Bassous, a professor of political science at the Islamic University of Gaza. Thank you very much for your time here on our program this evening.
You are most welcome.
Well, I'd like to ask you a fairly straightforward and basic question, if you will. From where you sit today and everything you've experienced throughout this conflict now, how can you envision this conflict coming to a peaceful resolution now?
Well, in fact, it's complicated. It's more than before. People were hoping that we going to see that a peaceful situation, peaceful solution would be coming up in the next few days. But yet the escalation and the military attacks intensified more than before. Difficult situation. And the last attack on the Gaza Strip was today, where a mother and her 4 children were killed by an Israeli Air Force strike. This was devastating for the family. It was difficult for anyone in Gaza to accept as a family like this. 4 children and the mother were killed. The last night and today were intensive fire as well from the Gaza Strip on the Israeli cities, and the same thing with the Israeli Air Force. We're shelling many places in Gaza. We find it difficult to assume that we're going to see in the next few days any ceasefire, despite the fact that Egypt invited both sides to talk again about the ceasefire and long-term truce. And I'm myself kind of optimistic that we're going to see something soon. But people in Gaza have lost hope. This is because we're about to be 50 days of this attack on the Gaza Strip. 50 days and nothing has been done yet. So it's difficult to believe. It's difficult to believe that any progress would take place in the next few days, despite the fact we understand that the Palestinian factions and the Palestinian Authority want to have a ceasefire, and the Israeli government want to have a ceasefire. But the problem is how they're going to achieve it, on what basis this would be achieved. And we understand in Gaza that Benjamin Netanyahu have made 2 conditions. One is cessation of all firing rockets from Gaza, and the second condition is not to talk about any seaport in the Gaza Strip if they would like to talk about negotiations on the long-term ceasefire. In any way, I think the Palestinian delegation have accepted this invitation. Initially has been accepted, and I think they're willing to go back to Egypt to talk about it. And I think they're waiting for the Israeli delegation to go back to Egypt to talk about the ceasefire. It's about the outcome and how much could be achieved and how long this ceasefire would last. And I think this is the difficult point. The demands made by the Palestinian factions and the demands were made by the Israeli side as well are difficult to have a common ground, difficult to compromise for both sides at
right.
this moment.
It's a question I wanted to ask you here in terms of how can either side essentially meet the other's demands without essentially giving in or looking as if they were defeated?
Well, at least you have the minimum standard. The minimum is both sides want to have a ceasefire, but at the same time, the Palestinians in Gaza want to rebuild what has been destroyed. You have seen on TV yesterday, I think that building, which was completely collapsed, which consists of about 60 flats. That's one example. When you talk about 10,000 homes were completely destroyed, how you going to bring cement and building materials to the Gaza Strip to rebuild these homes, how you're going to feed the families. It's a difficult situation. So the minimum standard is at least to open the crossing points, to bring all the necessities and supplies to the people of the Gaza Strip, to have a freedom of movement. The Palestinian Authority is willing to come back to Gaza. This is in coordination with all factions, because the Palestinian unity government was established
on that point about returning the Palestinian Authority, would the people there accept that, or would Hamas accept the return of the Palestinian Authority representatives now to any position of power in the Gaza Strip? In your opinion?
Of course they would accept. Of course they would accept, and all Palestinians in Gaza are accepting this fact. This is based on the unity agreement which was made in Gaza a few months ago, where Palestinian unity government was established. So people are waiting for the Palestinian Authority to manage the situation, to coordinate with Egypt and other regional players how they're going to help people in the Gaza Strip to survive, to have a decent life. And I think the Palestinians in Gaza, we have a unity here more than you can imagine. People could imagine it in a different way, but in fact, the unity in Gaza and the West Bank is more than it was before. It's unprecedented. And this is the example we have in the delegation in Egypt. This delegation, it consists of all Palestinian factions, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah, and other Palestinian factions. All want to have a ceasefire, and all of them want to have a long-term truce and build the Palestinian unity, and looking for the future, how they going to rebuild the Palestinian political system in the future after this war.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Hani Bassous from Islamic University in Gaza. Appreciate you on the program here. Yoav, yes, I sense you have much to say in response here.
I mean, if all Palestinians were like Dr. Bassous, we would have had peace here decades ago.
So the irrational individual.
Hamas will never let the PEA go back into Gaza. They might be obliged to let them control the Rafah crossing point, operate alongside the border with Israel, alongside the Philadelphia area. But there is no way, as long as Hamas is the only stronghold that the Islamic Brotherhood has now in the Middle East is Gaza. They won't give it up for the Palestinian Authority. I remind you that under the agreement, the government agreement that they've signed with Hamas, made a huge plot to take over that Israel just showed to the world a week ago. So, I wish Palestinians were like Dr. Bassous. I very much suspect that Hamas is closer to Al Qaeda and ISIS than to Mother Teresa in Calcutta.
Yes, Ambassador Levanon, I sense you agree with Yoav on some of these points here.
Yes, definitely yes. Because look, probably most of the Palestinians in Gaza would like to see Mahmoud Abbas coming back. Probably.
Considering the condition of things over the past years.
I don't know. We have to make a census, and ask the people. But probably yes, probably not. But I think that. I would like also to see Mahmoud Abbas going back to Gaza. But I think this is in the framework of a wishful thinking. I don't think that Mahmoud Abbas has enough power, militarily, physically, politically, morally, to go back and to be the new master, let's say, in Gaza. I don't think that Hamas will let him do that. Probably the maximum that he can do is to go back to the agreement of 2005 between the Palestinian Authority, Israel, and
we'll go out
the EU.
to a short break right now. We'll come back to this point with all three of our guests here at just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
שהטרוריסטים הבזים לדם ילדיהם לא יחוסו על דם ילדינו.
איננו ממהרים לשום מקום, יש לנו סבלנות, יש לנו אורך נשימה.
ليس هناك ما تخشاه المقاومة الفلسطينية التي تمارس مقاومة مشروعة مارستها كل الشعوب التي تعرضت للاحتلال.
חמאס משלם ועוד ישלם מחירים כבדים על הפשעים הללו שהוא מבצע.
Welcome back to our special edition coverage here at I-24 News. I'm joined in the studio by Lior Ackerman, former senior officer of the Israeli security agency, the Shin Bet, former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Yitzhak Levanon, and Yoav Limor, military analyst for Israel Hayom. Thank you all for being with us again here. Lior, I want to ask you another question now about some of the shifting things that we've seen here taking place in this conflict now. Again, we talked about the changing strategy, the targeted killings of Hamas leaders now. There's also been a lot of discussion, and you all put this out there before, about another potential ground incursion taking place at the hands of the IDF here now. One that might be much smaller, more focused. What might that entail? What might that involve? A secondary ground incursion now?
I think that it is very obvious. I'm not a military expert, but it's very obvious that any ground action inside the Gaza Strip now means a lot of casualties to Israel. And I think it's a price that the government and the army doesn't want to pay. And I can understand it. So I think that the best way of thinking and operating is by building a strategy how to weaken the Hamas. But it will not take not 2 days, not 3 days, not 5 days. The fact that we had reached to this operation again and again, and I said a few days before that it is the 8th or the 9th operation towards Gaza with the same terms, with the same place, after shooting missiles and rockets into Israel, after the Air Force bombing. We are in the same place. The Hamas is still there. This is the problem. He can still launch missiles towards Israel and rebuild everything that was before, because he is still ruling, and if there will be agreement...
The flow of information or the flow of intelligence now from the Israeli side, is there a big difference from a time when there are troops within the Gaza Strip to when the troops are outside of the Gaza Strip? Does that make a difference there?
Yes, there is a difference, because the ability of the intelligence to collect intelligence inside when the troops or the government is ruling the ground, so it's much easier, of course. When we are dealing with another country, with the border, it's much harder to do it. But still, you see that we can do it by human sources, by technologies, by any other means that the ISA operate. We can bring the intelligence, and we bring very good intelligence, although maybe it will not be in the same quality as we can bring from another places. From the West Bank and other places.
Where Israel controls.
But the fence is not stopping the intelligence from being collecting.
You asked, Leo, what Israel can do. There are three options. Israel can, A, take over the Gaza Strip. It's still on the table. I mean, it's a possibility. I don't support this possibility, but it is a possibility. Israel can get in, take over.
There have to be more troops called up for
Obviously, it will take a huge price by economy, by life, from both sides, etc., but it's a possibility that's on the table. Second possibility is to send pinpointed units for pinpointed missions, which will be mainly aimed to take a price from Hamas's assets. And the third mission, which in my eyes is the most likely to be if troops will be sent into Gaza, is to push the Hamas men who fire the rockets towards the Israeli kibbutzim and the cities that surround Gaza westwise. I mean,
further from the border.
Further from the border, far away.
To the Egyptian border?
No, towards the Egyptian and towards the sea. I mean, so it will make their life harder. It will make the life of the people that live in Sderot, in Ashkelon, or alongside the border easier in a way, because what we've seen in the past few days, Hamas tries to keep a level of 100 and more rockets that are being fired to Israel a day. But if at the beginning
Out of those 120, 30, 40 rockets a day, 20 to 30 were fired towards Tel Aviv area, 40 to 50 towards Ashdod and Beersheba, and the rest towards the area surrounding Gaza. Because of lack of rockets, they are firing only at least about once a day to Tel Aviv,
much more shorter
3-4 times a day to Ashdod and Beersheba, and a barrage of rockets towards and mortars towards the kibbutzim that surround Gaza. Their life became impossible. The mission of the Israeli army now is to push those who fire the rockets and the mortar shells in order to make the life in the area that surround Gaza easier. So if out of the three options, take over Gaza, pinpointed missions, and to push back the shooters, I will go for the latter one.
Look, David, I'm not a military tactician, definitely not. But my common sense say, I don't think that we need to go for a ground incursion in order to recapture Gaza. Because at the end of it, after that we'll capture Gaza again, we'll have to bring Abu Mazen and all the people, look, I'm not going, to make the job of Abu Mazen and the others. This is not my job to do it. And I don't want that, our children will be killed for that. But yes, definitely, I think that we have to go back to the kind of creativity or innovation that we used to have in Tzahal, in the IDF. And this is precisely, I remember when we landed forces in Baalbek in Beirut in the midst of the Hezbollah bastion. I remember, in Entebbe, I remember the Green Island, when we did, the whole world says, wow. I think this is what we need now with Hamas, the ping point, that Yoav is saying, with a kind of a spectacular military operation that we do it, we go back. And the whole world will say, wow, and the Hamas is losing his balance.
Well, aside from the military now, again, there's the diplomatic arena to focus on. And with the collapse of the Egyptian efforts to end the Gaza war, the United States, Britain, France, and Germany are now discussing a possible Security Council resolution calling for a sustainable ceasefire and an international monitoring mission to ensure its implementation, an initiative that the key players in the current conflict may try to avoid. Well, I-24 News correspondent Uwe Shapira has the story.
After the negotiations in Cairo collapsed last week, all eyes are pointed to New York. Over the weekend, the US, UK, France and Germany discussed a possible Security Council resolution that will end the crisis in Gaza. According to reports, the resolution will include an international monitoring mission in Gaza and the return of control of the Strip to the Palestinian Authority. Top diplomat promised to work intensively to bring the resolution to the UN in the next few days.
Clearly, there needs to be some assurances for Israel's security, but at the same time, there need to be assurances that the Gazans can live in peace and security and undertake proper economic activity.
As the UN resolution efforts are underway, behind-the-scenes attempts to revive the truce talks continue in Cairo. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas held talks Saturday with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and members of the Arab League. Abbas told the Egyptian media Sunday that he will present a new initiative next week that may lead the way for a breakthrough in the talks.
This is an unconventional solution. It doesn't include an attack on Israel, and this initiative consists of a political and diplomatic solution.
In the meantime, the Palestinians are intensifying their efforts to tackle Israel in the legal arena. Hamas signed a pledge on Saturday to back any Palestinian bid to the International Criminal Court in Hague.
There is nothing to fear. The Palestinian factions are leading a legitimate resistance in keeping with all international laws and standards. We are in a state of self-defense.
But it seems that none of the factions involved, be it Israel, the Palestinians and Egypt, welcome a Security Council resolution which would tie their hands. On the other hand, some analysts have mentioned Security Council Resolution 1701, which put an end to the second war in Lebanon in 2006 in similar conditions. Perhaps a parallel framework can lead to quiet in Gaza and Israel after more than a month and a half of fighting.
Well, thank you for joining us back in the studio now. In the short time we have left, Ambassador Lebanon, you mentioned Israel perhaps taking some larger risks to try to really implement a game changer here now in the form of potentially commando raids or something unexpected in this conflict now. There hasn't been much of that to this point. Obviously, the entire campaign is a risk.
Hamadeh first one, the three...
Going after the top leadership.
3 military, yes. Yes, it was one of these spectacular, let's say, operation that has a good, very efficient.
Leo, do you agree with that? Or do you think there's something else yet on the table, something that hasn't been employed yet that we may yet see before this thing is drawn to a ceasefire?
I think there are a lot of other means that Israel could do. It's not simple. It's not that you can enter troops inside and destroy everything and go home after a few days and you beat the Hamas. I know it's not. But as I said before, if you build a strategy before and you're going towards this strategy and you implement it, you can do a lot of things against the Hamas, either by means of money from other countries, either by using other countries' power on the Hamas, which we didn't use it, other Arab countries form around, and force. Yes, we could have been used more force against the Hamas. We didn't do it. We reacting, I think, and this is the fact that Israel is mostly reacting.
So in this, you're saying Hamas has been holding the initiative here.
Yes.
Certainly
David, look over your left shoulder. You see what it says there? 48 days. After 48 days, it's very hard to restart. I mean, we are looking for an ending,
we're
not
out of
for
time.
a beginning.
I apologize. Thank you very much, Yoav Limor, Leo Ackerman, and of course, Ambassador Yitzhak Lebanon. Thank you for your time on our special edition here. And now, just earlier today, I sat down with a member of Israeli parliament and former deputy director of Israel's Internal Security Service, Yisrael Hassan. Well, here's his take on the military strategy, Hamas, and Israel's options. Now, your position, your professional position, before arriving in the government some years ago, I think it was 2006 that you officially became a member of the government here, but your professional position, I think, puts you in an interesting role today to give us a look at the negotiations, the things that have taken place so far in terms of the Gaza conflict now with Hamas. What's your perception so far of what you've seen take place in all the various ceasefires that have been agreed to and broken, the various attempts to reach an agreement? Has the process that it's taken so long, has it surprised you?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all, because the Hamas, in my opinion, at a certain point, gave up the interest of the Palestinian people and gave up the Hamas interest, and it acts now through the angle of the Qatar-Turkey kind of angle. And Hamas, on the fourth day of the war, was already ready to come to such an arrangement of some sort, because what it is demanding, anybody who really knows realita knows that what they want really, there's no problem to supply. A lot of it, actually, it's a question of rumors and a world of propaganda and slogans. When I asked, and I met people during the war, people who are decision makers on the other side, and I asked them, what's a blockade? Tell me, what is a blockade? What do you want so that there will be no blockade? And they said to open the passages, the crossing. I said, we've been talking to you about it for a year and a half. Why didn't you agree? Hamas came into this operation as a result of its own internal evaluation of the situation, not by external forces. Hamas went into this operation as a result from the fall of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. And as a result of that, inside the Palestinian camp, they found out there's an alternative. The State of Israel vis-à-vis the PA for 9 years already does not shoot one bullet. It doesn't fight. There's no violent conflict between Israel and the PA. The only ones that we have a violence with is Hamas. Hamas and the Islamic Jihad.
Position is Hamas is in today. Do you agree with the concept that Hamas has nothing to lose, and perhaps that's why they're playing such a hard negotiating game here?
Hamas has a lot to lose. Hamas does lose. And Hamas, in my opinion, still doesn't understand how much it's going to lose. Not from the military point of view, but in the general aspect. They don't understand how much they're going to lose. Today, the public opinion in the Gaza Strip, the spirit inside Gaza, I'll say it in a very simple way. Today, the Hamas expects to get assistance, not not from the Arab countries, but from the West. It doesn't expect the Arabs to help it. It expects that the Westerners are going to help him. It doesn't have any expectations. They know that among the Arab world, even among the Palestinians, Judea and Samaria don't go up in the air because of what's happening, because they know that the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad are waging a fundamentalistic religious war, which is far from the Palestinian interest.
Speaking about Egypt and Cairo's so far central role in what's taken place, they've been unable to reach an agreement here. Very different from 2012, the last operation, where the Egyptians did play a central role. They were closely allied with Hamas. Do you think that now, based on the current Egyptian government's animosity towards Hamas, that they're in the wrong position, that perhaps they're not the right player now to try to broker a ceasefire? Even though they share a border, even though they do have common interests here.
The ones who are supposed to create a solution for the Palestinians, not for the Hamas. Hamas are not important in this whole issue. What's important is the Palestinians in Gaza, the ones who are supposed to give them a solution to trade, to go out in the world, to go through them, to have a reasonable economy, are the Egyptians and the Israelis. Now, it cannot be that you will come to me and say, listen, you're going to create a solution, but you're not the right person to negotiate with. If you don't want to buy the goods from me, then okay. But if you want to buy the goods from me, so who's going to negotiate with? You're going to speak to my neighbor? There's no question about it. The Hamas knows very well that the solution is at hand. To shoot 5,000 rockets on civilians in order to open a crossing. A year and a half ago, this discussion already ended. So what are we talking about? Hamas did something in order to save itself on account of the citizens of Gaza and the Palestinian people, on account of the Palestinian people. Neither us nor the Egyptians or the Palestinians are going to allow them. The inhabitants of Gaza, unfortunately, at the moment, there's nothing we can do.
What's the way out of this current situation for Israel, then? Is Qatar perhaps the missing piece here? They're a relatively new player in this negotiation game with Israel and the Palestinians. How can Israel get out of this now?
Look, all over the world, we know that there's no such thing which is called double insurance. You cannot insure yourself in 2-3 companies and finally to get the insurance policy from all three. Qatar is a state that has 10 insurance policies on everything that's going to happen. They are with the Americans, but they're also with the Hamas, and they're also with the Jihad, and they're also with the Iranians, and with people against God. They are collecting insurance policies. I think that they went overboard in their intervention. They're a failure. They're not a solution. And in that respect, I tell you, we suffer from it at the moment. The Arab world has been suffering from them all over the place. They're doing it in such arrogance, in such audacity, that's incredible. And I hope that one day will come and somebody in the Arab world is going to settle the account with them, not us.
But in terms of Israel now finding a way to resolve this ongoing, over 6-week-long conflict now, violent conflict with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, taking a massive toll on the Gaza Strip, on the Palestinian people, on Israelis. Now, how can this come to a resolution, in your opinion, without handing Hamas some sort of reward for their militancy?
David, if terror is going to lay its arms, you know there's going to be peace here, and you understand it. If the state of Israel will lay its arms down, it's going to not exist. This solution is only to lay down the arms. The Gaza Strip will be, not now, but it will be demilitarized from terror arms. The inhabitants will have to decide what kind of track they're going to choose. And the Hamas will have nothing to say about it in about 6 months, a year from today. And here I tell you something, if you invite me here in 6 months, see if I was right or not.
We would love to have you back in 6 months. In the meantime, as well, how can this demilitarization be achieved? Is this up to Israel alone, or are there actual international players that can step in and help in this effort?
The name of the game is a process. What kind of contra-process you create with the Hamas? If you take the solution that says crossings, international passages, and towards Israel under the control of Abu Mazen on the one hand, the Egyptians on the other, and the common interests are clear. There's no policy here that encourages terror. In 2012, when Morsi made the agreement, he also, on surface and under the ground, he transferred all the missiles of 7, 8, 9 meters long. It's not something that you can hide in a bicycle. He transferred all these means in order to create those tunnels. He played the double talk. Today, there's an Egyptian policy that understands the price of fundamentalistic regime. And I think that the entire world is beginning to understand that. And not in vain did our Prime Minister said, Hamas is ISIS, ISIS is Hamas. There's no such thing, democracy and religion. We don't invent it. The entire world knows the difference between church and state. But all of a sudden, this is a new patent that religion is the state. There's no such thing in the world. There's no such reality. You cannot have such a relationship, neither from our side or theirs. And because of that, I sincerely hope that we are going to go into a process whereby there will be no terror weapons in Gaza in the next few years.
After 48 days of Operation Protective Edge, 6 weeks of war, essentially now, we've seen many tactics used in this conflict by both sides. But only recently now, this week, have we seen the effective use of targeted killings by the Israeli side, now going after Hamas top leadership. Does that reflect, as far as you know, does that reflect a new strategy by the IDF, or is that a new, perhaps, strategic failure by Hamas leaders now, not hiding in the right places or changing their tactics?
It reflects only one thing, the fact that the Hamas leaders came out of their holes for a few hours. We waited. We, by the way, people, they say we don't have any patience. We waited 2,000 years. For us, 45 days, another 2 hours, another week. No problem. There will be no situation whereby a person who will jeopardize the Israeli sovereignty and the security of the State of Israel and hit innocents, and that's what they want to do, that he will be alive on this earth.
New, perhaps the right new strategy for the IDF to go after the leadership now, after going after rockets, going after tunnels, going after essentially the Hamas fighting ability from the ground up. Now it seems to be a top-down approach. Is that a good strategy, in your opinion?
David, you'll be surprised if I tell you that we can do a few things at the time. You know, at this operation, the IDF did not use 10% of its capabilities. And I'm saying not even 10%. The State of Israel did not use 10% of its capabilities. Let's not be mistaken. That, too, we can do all these things simultaneously. And if we decide to do more simultaneously, we will be able to do that as well. At the moment, we think it's not necessary. We would like to complete this military procedure with a political one, and we hope the Hamas will stop with the Qatari interest, but their own.
The list of targeted individuals in Gaza this week, Mohammed Deif, the head of the Hamas military wing, essentially credited for much of the strategy being employed against Israel now today. Do you think he's alive or dead?
I personally think he's dead, but I don't have any problem to wait patiently until I get proof. But with your permission, I want to correct one thing. The big name that we have to really struggle with is Khaled Mash'al. And I think that we have to do anything we can, even on the Qatari state.
The risk involved in going in and doing an operation like that in a place like Qatar is worth what could be achieved by taking him out?
Don't put the State of Israel to the test. To sit in Qatar and to shoot and to motivate a process that kills children of 4 years old, like yesterday, and thinks that he can continue to do that and be safe, and that the Qatars, they are his insurance policy. I tell you, the State of Israel can surprise even in that. And let us not test us.
Why do you think he's the greater threat or the best target than some of the military leaders in the Gaza Strip who are running the conflict closely?
He's the blockage. He's the one who mobilizes. He's the barrier that stops the solution because he represents the Qatari interests. Full point. And because of that, whatever the Hamas wants could have been done through Egypt. The Qatari do not want it to be given through Egypt. The guy thinks that he can continue to mobilize a whole bloodshed process. There's no state in the entire world that would enable anybody to sit secure and safe in a hotel, 19 stars, not 5, to enjoy what the Qatari money can do, and he does it all over the world. See what they do with the money of Qatar in the United States, and would be, enable him to kill a little boy. Not one state in the world would allow that. And Israel as well has supposed not to enable this.
In the short time that we have left, what are the chances, in your opinion, of Israel and Hamas coming back together anytime soon at the Cairo negotiating table?
Well, the state of Israel is ready to go to Cairo, but I think that we have to go to the first condition that was violated by the Hamas many times. Ceasefire with no conditions, and then there should be an agreement for truce, for ceasefire, and then you discuss an agreement. You don't discuss agreement under fire. There's no such thing. No such thing. Look, what's the Hamas? Let's say in one word, what is Hamas? You look at it. This is an organization, terror, that sits there in Gaza Strip. So what? The state of Israel, had it decided with its military force to throw him out, we could have done it. The state of Israel does not want to violate the balance. Or I tell you, the Hamas does not know how to appreciate today what its fate is going to be in 2-3 weeks from now. And it fights for its life. It doesn't fight for the life of the citizens in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you very much for your time, Israel Hassan. Really appreciate it.
Well, again, this is our special edition here, day 48 of Operation Protective Edge. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go anywhere.
שהטרוריסטים הבזים לדם ילדיהם לא יחוסו על דם ילדינו.
איננו ממהרים לשום מקום, יש לנו סבלנות, יש לנו אורך נשימה.
ليس هناك ما تخشاه المقاومة الفلسطينية التي تمارس مقاومة مشروعة مارستها كل الشعوب التي تعرضت للاحتلال.
חמאס משלם ועוד ישלם מחירים כבדים על הפשעים הללו שהוא מבצע.
Welcome back to this special edition, day 48 of Operation Protective Edge now, as Israel confronts Hamas in and around the Gaza Strip. Well, joining me now on set is Ruth Wasserman-Land, former Israeli deputy ambassador to Egypt, and colonel in the reserves and former international, that is, media advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister, Miri Eisen, and Hilit Barel, former director of the Israeli National Security Council. Thank you all for joining us here on this Day 48, as we continue to understand what's taking place in this operation, look at the effects. One of the main places that I think it's important to focus as well right now, and for the purpose of our discussion, is some of the developments within Israel as this is all taking place. Miri, I'd like to start by asking you, we've talked so much throughout this conflict about the sides looking for a sense of victory or something they can point to and say, this has been achieved, you know, we've done this, we've done that. Certainly Hamas has struggled for some of those images. After some of the recent developments, I would ask you if you think that perhaps Hamas has already reached some level of tactical victory, shutting down the airport in Israel for a 2-day period during this conflict recently, weeks ago now. But having the Prime Minister of Israel now talk about a war of attrition, in other words, that there is no clear and quick way to wrap this up. Also something that, in my opinion, plays to the strategy of Hamas. And of course, you know, murdering a child just the other day now, a 4-year-old boy. We'll talk about more in this program, but some of these things, do you think that they amount to some sort of tactical victory for Hamas in the face of the Israeli public, who has so far been relatively shielded from the violence?
There's no question that when we look at that day 48, we talk about 48 days, that seems on the one hand that would be a tactical victory, but you know what, in that sense, I actually sit here strong and I feel, no, in its own way it also is not, because Israel still stands strong. The fact that we have differing voices, that's part of our strength, not our weakness. The fact that we're standing up and asking both our own government, what are we doing, and looking around and reaching out, that's part of our strength, not our weakness. And I think in that sense, Hamas is trying to push all of the buttons. David, you know what, they're not managing to achieve what they want to achieve. If after 48 days, and my heart goes out to a little 4-year-old boy, what they've managed to do is to kill one little boy who was living in a kibbutz right next to the Gaza Strip border, then I kind of think, no, that's not even a tactical victory. I do honestly think that in its own way, it makes us stronger, it makes us more resolved, and they are going to be wrong if they think that this is hurting our resolve. Having said all of that, 48 days is a long time. I say that as a mother, I say that as living in Tel Aviv, I say that as being somebody within this whole conflict. And this, as it goes on, what I'm worried about more is not so much that tactical victory. What I'm worried about more is Israel's domestic front, the economy, people's jobs. I want to give the most silly little example, and I'm saying this on purpose here on I-24. I think that people don't think about this worldwide. So, should I go do my nails? What, are you kidding? I'm going to sit there and the siren's going to go off? I mean, little businesses aren't going to do well at a time like this. People aren't doing the regular little things. We're living our lives. They haven't shut us down. But at the end, we're doing everything a little bit less. And I am worried about the economy.
Certainly in the South, where it's estimated up to 70% of the residents have already cleared out of the area. Of course, businesses, small businesses, the first thing to really be hurt. Well, now we'll go to one of those communities here, Ashkelon, one of the larger southern towns in Israel here, southern coastal town. Eli Ochenberg, our correspondent now, standing by there. Eli, tonight, you've been covering this conflict throughout since the beginning now, and Ashkelon has been one of the epicenters now with so much rocket fire targeted at the city here along the coast. What's going on there now? I understand there was a direct hit there and on a home by a rocket now today, and you're there now. Can you tell us what's going on?
Yes, David, the building right behind me is the one that was hit during a heavy barrage of rockets an hour ago towards the city of Ashkelon. 2 buildings were hit by the rockets. No injuries, only damage. A 3rd rocket landed in an open area a bit northern to the city of Ashkelon. But these heavy barrages of rockets are happening all throughout the last couple of days, and the residents of the city of Ashkelon are very confused. The red siren alerts are just non-stop ongoing all throughout the weekend and today as well. So the situation here is very tense yet again, and not only here, of course, along the Israel-Gaza border as well. There the barrages of rockets are a bit heavier, and residents are very much confused. The school year is supposed to open next week. A lot of parents, a lot of children do not know what will happen, and these decisions will have to be taken by the political level, and the residents here are very much anticipated to hear what will be in the upcoming days, because the long-term and short-term strategy of Israel at the moment is still unclear to the southern residents, and we'll of course keep you updated. But again, 2 direct hits and 2 buildings in Ashkelon, no injuries, only damage, but as we've seen in the last couple of days, this incident could have ended differently. Thank God it ended in this way, David.
Well, Elias, you're outside of a home there, a residence that's been hit directly by a rocket. Again, no injuries, but as you are there with the people from the town that are there, obviously who come to see what happened there, people standing around the scene, what's the sense among those people? Is it anger, frustration, or is there just a sense of resignation among these people that this is how it is and they shrug it off?
Well, it's almost a daily routine of the southern residents to come to the places where there was a direct hit. And like any other time, they're gathering here looking at the damage. Thank God, again, it's only a damage with property this time. And they cannot believe this is their reality. For over a month now, it was a very difficult summer. And every couple of weeks, they feel like it's ending. They feel like the operation is coming to an end. But here we are in another round of heavy barrages of rockets and fighting on the Israeli side as well. So a lot of frustration, definitely, David, and I think that the residents of southern Israel are no longer accepting this situation. They want a clear-cut solution, both in the short term and, of course, in the long term. So a lot of frustration, definitely, here tonight, David.
Well, thank you for that update from the Israeli city of Ashkelon. Eli Ochenberg, our correspondent, standing by. Now, back in studio, we were just talking about some of the effects on the Israeli home front from this campaign. The Iron Dome anti-missile system has been, some have argued, miraculous in its ability to protect the home front, to keep these rockets, these thousands of rockets now, from doing more damage around the country. And as the Prime Minister talks about a war of attrition here and preps his people for the long run, talking about something that may continue for a while now still. In other words, the message to the public is that they have to maintain, and actually, as I'm telling you this, there are sirens in Jerusalem as we speak right now. The long-range missiles are still being fired. Do you think that the Israeli public can endure that? Does that war of attrition? Obviously, Israel, strong country economically, militarily, compared to the Gaza Strip, which is almost in an opposite situation, one would argue. Yet the costs are there. You know, on paper, the price of the mortars, the price of the Qassams and these rockets that are being built in Gaza, the numbers add up quickly on the Israeli side. All of the precision munitions, the Iron Dome missiles, estimated between $50,000 to $100,000 a piece. The cost on tourism, and as we mentioned, the cost on the southern economy, and not just the southern economy here. Again, as rockets are hitting Jerusalem as we speak, the nation's capital. How big of an appetite, for lack of a better term here, does the Israeli public, in your opinion, have for this kind of a conflict? How long can the government allow it to go on?
I think there are two different questions. The issue of an appetite, I don't think the Israeli public had a great appetite for this from the beginning, and I think that was very much manifested in the position that the government took on this. It was not only a reflection of public opinion, but it certainly took it into account quite significantly. However, in terms of resilience, I think we've proven that the Israeli public is quite resilient. It doesn't have to do only with Iron Dome. Actually, I think one of the interesting things of Iron Dome and of missile defense systems of all sorts is that in that they decrease the lethality of the weapons that are launched at us and decreased, obviously, very significantly the casualties, they also erode, in a certain way, legitimacy. Because what you hear is you haven't suffered that badly from this.
As they've seen joked about in international media from Jon Stewart.
But there's a point to that. I mean, it's true in terms of every weapon. The less lethal the weapon becomes, the more easily it is used and accepted as used, and that's a problem that we currently face because it's much harder to explain what you were trying to touch on, which is the stress, the costs. In many, many ways. So it's much easier to show a 4-year-old. It's harder in real terms, but in terms of explaining what is going on in the country. So I think even with that situation, the Israeli public, I think, is very resilient. That's not, and I think Israel has faced much more difficult situations. We've got to remember that. I mean, this is a very tough neighborhood, and we have to be resilient to prevail. Having said that, sure, there are great costs, and I think one of the things coming out of this that we really need to pay attention to this time more significantly than we did after the Second Lebanon War is the issue of you could call it the home front, the civilian front. We have to understand that the real threats facing Israel today that have to do with terrorism and missiles really target the civilian population, and we have to be much better prepared in terms of containing that in a long term, in a matter of economics as well. We're seeing one of the biggest issues in the South really is the economic issue, not just everyday living, of course.
The military impact, part of the story.
No, both, of course, but also even this issue where they had to ask for special funding in order to leave their houses. I mean, these are things that we need to learn how to do more smoothly for next time. So certainly there are costs.
Now, Ruth, Shifting our focus now, there's another population center here that's suffering greatly in this conflict. Aside from the Israeli south and parts of the country obviously been affected, as we mentioned, the people of the Gaza Strip now, with some most recent reports say up to 350,000 people displaced from their homes, a disaster from one end to another in this enclave, with the destruction that's been leveled by Israeli strikes, the lack of humanitarian supplies, water, everything else that we've heard about, and obviously the great death toll with the enormous civilian numbers to it there. Focusing on that now, how significant do you believe that that plays into everything, the discussions surrounding this now, as Egypt, a neighbor and also a country known to have, in the street at least, sentiments towards the welfare of the Palestinian people, whether or not policy reflects that is another discussion, but definitely affecting sentiments both within Israel and within Egypt, which we'll get to in a minute, talking about Egypt, who's now been brokering the ceasefire talks. How significant does that situation play into how this can be resolved, or how much longer it can go on? Is that part of the Israeli calculation?
How long can this go on? And speaking about the toll, the people, deaths, and the humanitarian crisis is a very difficult equilibrium, a very sentimental one, a very emotional one, and it always depends on whom you ask. You've mentioned Egypt, and I'd like to mention several other role players or stakeholders in the region that have a say in this whole scenario. First of all, let's look at the Palestinian people to begin with. There's a huge, I would even say, hatred between the Fatah and the Abu Mazen clan and his people and supporters and the Hamas. So when both sides sit in Cairo, the hatred or the discontent one side from the other is very, very felt, and very often things cannot move forward because of the disagreement between the two sides. The fact that a unity government or a so-called unity government was reached several months prior to that, and even nowadays there are talks of Abu Mazen reaching certain kinds of agreements in Qatar.
Those statements today that is a new plan, a surprising new plan.
And plans can be declarative plans, which are, by the way, not less good, but we need to understand that the rifts between the factions are very, very significant. So when we speak about the Palestinian people, there is a rift between the Palestinian people themselves. Now, the Egyptians feel and understand this rift and have an interest in this rift as other stakeholders in the region, seeing the Abu Mazen side of the Palestinian people as the real legitimate leadership, or rather the leadership that suits the Egyptian stance, thereby trying to strengthen this faction all the time and strengthening it by actually at the same time weakening the Hamas. And you can add to that equilibrium Saudi Arabia, you can add Kuwait, you can also add Jordan, which is keeping quiet because of the population within it, but still has a tremendous stake in having the less radical factions take hold of the situation. So the situation is really looking at the region in a very complex narrative and understanding the different interests. I do feel that I need to add one more point, and that is that Sisi's Egypt sees itself at the helm of, I would say, a moderate chasm or a moderate group of countries which really needs to stand off and fight, completely disregarding Israel, by the way, the radical front led by the Islamic State, on the one hand, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. That is from the viewpoint of Egypt. And having said that, the Israeli interest in some way, not a little way, plays into that.
We'll come back to all of our guests here in studio in a moment. Right now, our correspondent Shai Ben-Ari is standing by on the Gaza-Israel border now. Shai, I understand that you've seen some action there recently, right?
Right, David. Over the past few minutes, we've seen it certainly pick up now. We're talking about the northern Gaza Strip. We're seeing a fairly heavy bombardment, a number of explosions that we could actually see, very large even fireballs basically appearing on the horizon not far from us, a few miles behind us. How it works is you usually see the explosion, and then basically a few seconds after, you hear it. You hear the loud boom sort of go off, and sometimes you can even feel something of a shockwave. depending on how close you are really, but we're a few kilometers away. You could actually feel the buildings around you shake. That was the case here a number of times over the past hour or so. We also saw one launch of a rocket basically to the north of here. A little bit after that, we received reports of basically sirens going off in the Jerusalem Hills region, with a number of communities there basically targeted. We don't know we don't have any information yet on what may have happened with that rocket launched to that area. But basically, this situation continues, and we're seeing it, as it often does, pick up into the evening with a more intense Israeli bombardment now in comparison with daytime. And we are talking about a very large number of Palestinian casualties throughout this conflict. The reports today from Palestinian media speak of 13 casualties. That does not include the attacks that we were seeing just a few minutes ago. A number of children apparently killed in the attacks today. That brings the overall total to over 2,100 Palestinians dead as a result of this conflict. That is a situation, obviously, a very large gap between Palestinian casualties and Israeli casualties as a result of this conflict. Much of this because of the defensive systems that Israel has in place to combat the threats that Hamas uses against Israel.
Well, Shai Ben-Arni, our correspondent, standing by on the border with Gaza and Israel. Thank you for the report. Back in studio now, just speaking about keeping some of the extremists at bay in the region. Certainly a relevant theme for many, if not all, of the nations in this region, in the Middle East. Specifically Israel now, talking about keeping that element of society under control during this conflict. Miri, the Prime Minister has somewhat done that. Some of his more far right-wing politicians have been very vocal throughout this campaign. There has been some ugly events taking place within Israeli society this summer as well at the hands of extremists. The revenge kidnapping of a Palestinian boy after the 3 teenagers were kidnapped themselves in the West Bank. What does it say to you? How do you see the Israeli government either succeeding or grappling with some of the extremist voices within Israeli society throughout this conflict, many of which have called for much harder action on the Gaza Strip?
I actually feel a lot worse about those issues than I do about the ongoing operation. And I say it very sadly. I think that this operation, and especially that we count it from day 48, we're counting that from the rocket firing into Israel when the whole aspect of everything going on turned to the Gaza Strip. To a certain degree, Israeli society, the Israeli government, the Israeli people did not face what was going on in the 3 weeks of both the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli teenagers and then the counter-kidnapping of the Palestinian teenager and his murder. And I do think that these are things that Israeli society needs to face. I'll add even a bit more of my sorrow. I think that over the last 48 days, people who have different voices, and it's not because I agree with them, but I do think that they're allowed to be heard. And I think that those different voices in the consensus inside Israel, which, by the way, is part of our resilience, but within that consensus, what happened is people who wanted to offer different voices, different ideas, they weren't shouted down. They were kind of boxed out of the room, and quite violently, meaning you couldn't go out and do a protest against this war inside Israel. And I say this sadly. I think these are things that we need to face, and we need to face them sooner rather than later. David, I live inside Israel, and right now we are inside a conflict, and this is not an easy one for anybody. Sirens in Jerusalem, I just want to remind you that in the last 48 hours, we've had sirens on the Syrian front, on the Lebanese front, on the Tel Aviv front, on the Jerusalem front, on the south front. Wow, let's go down to Eilat, right? But I say that because it's everywhere in Israel. There isn't any place right now inside Israel where you feel safe, where you feel secure. Having said that, we give defense. We're here. But inside that inner security is that capability to have dialogue, to have talk, to be able to bridge the different bridges we need to here. And I think that that's one thing that we have a lot of work that we are going to need to face. And I don't think we can right now, and we have to afterwards. I have not heard any voices from within the government who are trying to address these things, only voices from outside.
The counter voices from the government. You're right. No one leading that message exactly.
It's a message in itself, which is again, I'm very somber about it because I need perhaps the president and the new president said a few things about that. President Rivlin, when he just came in, certainly President Peres was addressing that before he finished his tenure. But these are things that we are going to face as a society the day after, no matter what.
Well, and I'm attempting not to sound cold by presenting this in the way I am, but with the 4-year-old boy being killed in Israel now from enemy fire from the Gaza Strip now, do you believe that changes the game for Israel in some way in this conflict? Is that now a forced change now in terms of how Israel must approach this or how the conflict goes from here, or is that something that was already, do you think, calculated into this equation from the beginning?
I think what that did was clarify that this reality that the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense were trying to create simply does not exist. In other words, I think there was an attempt to create a reality of victory and a diminishing conflict just by saying, this is how it's going to be, and trying to create it through signaling and on the ground. And clearly, that's not happening. I think that's the main thing that changed with these past couple of days. I think, again, it also brings a lot of attention to the deficiencies in dealing with the home front, especially down south. I think 6 weeks is a long time to be able to prepare and to have executed by now something a little more convincing for the people who are very, very strong and tough people who are living there, and that's something to pay attention to. But I also wanted to tap into what we were talking about before with the regional players and add one, which I think is a very big and confusing one, which is Iran, and it has to do. And the reason I say that is that we did today see two new things from Iran. One is a claim that an unmanned vehicle, an Israeli unmanned vehicle, was shot over Natanz, which is their centrifuge facility. And the other one was a call to Hamas not to consider a ceasefire. After a long time where what we've seen was a distancing of Iran from Hamas and diminishing funding for Hamas and support for Hamas. So I think that's something very interesting to pay attention to. Iran is somewhere in between definitely understanding the Daesh problem, definitely understanding the threats that it faces from such movements, but at the same time also negotiating a nuclear deal which was extended from July 20th for 4 more months, will end in November.
Detente with Iran and the United States. It's great.
Well, right. I'm not sure I would call it detente. Yeah, I'm not sure I would call it detente, a negotiation on a very confined subject at this time. A lot of speculation about other cooperation between the United States and Iran, for sure. So I raise that because I think that definitely is something to look in the mix, and also something to consider when we think about Israeli options for moving ahead. What might this horizon that the Prime Minister talked about when he talked about a political horizon, what might it look like? Who are the partners for that? And I'm not implying that Iran is a partner, but I am implying that the Iranian threat does create opportunity for partnership with countries that, and together with Daesh threat, that beforehand were more reticent.
Certainly a complex region now. Speaking of partnerships, the Egyptian position here, Egypt now, having emerged from revolutions, this government, the opposite of what was in place in 2012 during the last conflict with Hamas now. What is what you've seen taking place here in terms of Egypt taking the role of mediator in this position from the beginning, presenting their ceasefire plan, trying to manage this crisis, trying to become that regional power again? What does it say to you about the relationship now between Israel and the new, or some would argue old, regime that's now in place in Egypt now? Is this a good trend? What does it say to you?
First of all, it is a good trend. I think that is an opportunity to strengthen the already strong relationship between Israel and Egypt. Having said that, it needs to be perhaps emphasized that the Egyptian policy serves first and foremost Egypt, which is quite legitimate, but it needs to be understood. And having understood that, I think that the Israeli policy does look at its own interests vis-a-vis this comprehension of Egyptian interests. And the interests are relatively very well aligned at this point in time. First of all, the wish not to allow the movement or the instability from the Gaza Strip to enter the Sinai Peninsula is a very strong motivation by the Egyptians. And Hamas is seen as a player, a stakeholder, which has an interest in meddling with internal Egyptian affairs. In fact, the government and the regime in Egypt currently is, I would say, even promoting this idea vis-a-vis the public, and the public is accepting this idea. In fact, when there was the assassination recently of very senior figures in the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, The Egyptian public, again, not all of it, because not all of it supports Sisi, but a significant portion of it does, and significant newspapers actually were very pleased to see this assassination because these specific people were seen as meddling within internal affairs in Egypt itself. So the alignment, very obviously, is a very strong alignment. That does not go to say that the Egyptian interest is not in any way keen to bring about a broader understanding between the Palestinian people in general and the Israelis, and to be seen as the broker of this kind of an agreement. And it will do and take significant steps to promote this idea in the day after the tactical issue of Gaza.
This may be just the beginning, the prelude, or an early chapter to Egypt's renewed involvement between Israel and the Palestinians.
Absolutely. The Egyptian public wants to see some kind of a resolution between Israel and the Palestinian people, not
Especially
liking...
brokered by them.
Not especially, specifically and only brokered by Egypt.
Thank you very much, Ruth Wasserman and Hanit Borel and Miri Eisen. Thank you all for joining us on the special edition here. Again, we'll be back after a short break. Stay with us.
שהטרוריסטים הבזים לדם ילדיהם לא יחוסו על דם ילדינו.
איננו ממהרים לשום מקום, יש לנו סבלנות, יש לנו אורך נשימה.
ليس هناك ما تخشاه المقاومة الفلسطينية التي تمارس مقاومة مشروعة مارستها كل الشعوب التي تعرضت للاحتلال.
חמאס משלם ועוד ישלם מחירים כבדים על הפשעים הללו שהוא מבצע.
Again, welcome back to our special edition coverage here on I-24 News. Day 48 of Operation Protective Edge, the war between Israel and Hamas in and around the Gaza Strip. Well, again, welcome back. And now with me in the studio is Avi Primor, former Israeli ambassador to the European Union, I-24 News host of The World This Week, Jacob Elon, and Dr. Emmanuel Navon, international relations expert at Tel Aviv University. Thank you all for joining us here as we continue our coverage of the ongoing conflict here now. Ambassador Primor, start by asking you about, as recently as today now, we know Egypt has been attempting to mediate a ceasefire here now between sides unsuccessfully for really the greater part of 6 weeks already. But today, the Palestinian Authority and Egypt again calling for a renewal of talks at the table in Cairo. And Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas coming out with statements, at least, about a new initiative, a surprising new initiative. What does that all signal to you? Is something positive taking place here?
I think everybody is interested in a ceasefire. This is very obvious. Israel wants it, Hamas wants it, everybody needs it. Egypt certainly wants it, but Egypt is powerless because Egypt has no influence over the Hamas today. The problem is that both sides are looking to save face. This is the real truth. Everybody wants to come out of this conflict with something that he could show it was worthwhile. He didn't do it for nothing. And I don't think we, Israel or the Hamas, are capable of finding a solution. Egypt certainly not. Mahmoud Abbas could help, but he won't be the one. We need the international community. We need the Security Council, which is going to meet. And we need, first and foremost, the Arab world. And that means that we have to come to terms with the Arab world, for an instance, on the base of the Saudi peace plan, which we have ignored until now. So we'll have to modify certain things.
We'll come back to this discussion in just a moment. Right now, we'll go to our correspondent, Shachar Pellet, who's standing by in the north of Israel, now in the town of Metula on the border here with Lebanon. Shachar, now, good to speak to you this evening there. After last night, with some flare-up in the region there, we know rockets were fired out of Syria and Lebanon just last night, sounding alarms in the region up there for people who've known some quiet for the better part of years now, since the war in 2006. What's the atmosphere there this evening?
Absolutely, David. Good evening. It's been a relatively calm day here in the northern border of Israel, following a not very quiet night. As you mentioned, there were 5 122-millimeter Grad rockets fired from Syria into the Golan Heights, exploding in open areas, and 2 more rockets fired from Lebanon last night into the Upper Galilee area, one hitting a residential area straight directly into a building where 2 children were lightly wounded, and dozens of more people suffered from shock and anxiety attacks. But today was relatively calm. We've actually seen some tourists coming to the area where we stand, and the north, which is not very used to this situation, is indeed concerned that one of its most popular zones of tourism will indeed be hurt, especially at this time of the year. The guest house are usually packed with people. Thus far, no organization has taken any responsibility over these attacks, and the IDF hasn't responded as well. And this is still a possibility of Palestinian small cells inside Lebanon as an act of solidarity with their brothers in the Gaza Strip. As we've seen in the past month, this is not the first time during this operation we've seen fire from the northern border. But as the concerns here gradually rise, people are trying to stay optimistic and hope this will not resume once again here in the north.
Well, Shachar, the people, are you getting the sense, I mean, these are people who may recently not have dealt with the issues of rocket fire, but certainly it's not a new concept to the people of this region now. Are you getting a sense of that people aren't too afraid of a flare-up in the north, or are people very worried up there about the war reaching their area as well?
Well, David, since the latest escalation was really in 2006 with the Second Lebanese War, people have gotten used to this more quiet situation. Although we've seen the issue of the tunnel threat rising also here in the north, some of the residents of the villages really bordering Lebanon and Syria have been complaining of some noises they've been hearing in the past couple of weeks and months underneath their homes, and are very concerned about a possible infiltration of terrorists or militants, whether from Palestinian cells or from Hezbollah, underneath their homes. Others are saying that this is not a possibility and that they are very calm and are trying to, in general, make this area much more calmer as it seems in the media. But as we've mentioned, in the past several years, the north hasn't known much fire and are trying to continue with this atmosphere of calm and peace and quiet, and also of course, inviting many residents from the north, from the south, from the south to seek some quiet here in the guest houses and the open hostels to try and, calm down from what is going on in their homes. They are hosting them, and with hopes that there will be no escalation here in the border.
Well, thank you very much, Shachar Peled, our correspondent, standing by in Israel's northern border now with Lebanon. We'll come back for any updates to her there. Professor Navon, the prospect of the war spreading to the north, of Hezbollah likely being behind some of the rockets fired now out of Syria and Lebanon overnight, does this speak of a new strategy being employed by Iran, perhaps, by that access now in a way to complicate the conflict with Hamas, or are these potentially not related in that type of way?
Well, it is a fact that despite the mishaps of the 2006 war, Hezbollah has been deterred and hasn't really been attacking Israel since then. And this is, by the way, one of the differences between Israel's war vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Hamas, because Israel has been able to deter Hezbollah more than it has been able to deter Hamas for various reasons, one of them being Hezbollah's dependency and a close relationship with Iran. Now, we have to understand that in terms of Hezbollah's strategy vis-a-vis Israel, we are in the middle of negotiations between the United States and Iran, which have been renewed recently upon the announcement of President Obama, and this has to be taken into account. According to the reports that we have, the rockets that have been shot from the north were shot by Palestinian cells, and it looks like they were not under the complete control of Hezbollah. But as I said, Hezbollah, since 2006, has been mostly deterred by the Second Lebanon War, again, despite the many drawbacks of that military operation at the time.
So you believe that the deterrence at work, or the successful deterrence that Israel waged in 2006, is based on the greater geopolitical factors behind the conflict there? You're saying different than Hamas, that some have argued exist today in a vacuum, in a way isolated. They don't have the same geopolitical constraints, so the deterrence hasn't worked as it has with Hezbollah.
Well, we have to understand that in terms of Hamas, first of all, got very encouraged by the unilateral Israeli withdrawal in 2005. Now, from Israel's perspective and mentality, withdrawing from Gaza was going to convince the Palestinians that Israel was serious about peace, but this is not the way they saw it. As a matter of fact, shortly after Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, as you remember, there were elections for the Palestinian Authority. And the very day before these elections, the interim prime minister of the time, Ehud Olmert, spoke at the Herzliya conference, and he addressed the Palestinian electorate saying, if you choose a moderate leadership, I promise you that we will basically get out of the West Bank and choose Hamas. What Hamas was saying is that, look, what we have been able to achieve through violence, what the PLO has not been able to achieve through negotiations. Now, you have to understand also that in addition, Hamas enjoys the very generous financial support of Qatar, the political support of Turkey. And this has been convincing Hamas that it can continue to fight at Israel. And to that, I should add that when 2 or 3 weeks ago the Obama administration decided to try and broker a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, it tried to do that via Turkey and Qatar, which boosted even more Hamas's morale.
We'll come back to certainly the international implications here, but in that arena, to some degree, Jacob, here, talking about the fixation on Israel and on this conflict that takes place in the international media specifically, and how that can sometimes drive the conflict, or at least influence the conflict here. You've covered conflict in this region for many years, been in the epicenter of that storm for some of the most intense conflicts of the last decades. With so much going on in the world today, we have wars taking place everywhere from Libya, the entire Middle East. Russia and Ukraine are fighting a war now. Is there still, do you believe, have you seen the adequate appetite for the story here taking place now between Israel and Hamas, and how significant is that in this conflict?
There was a major shift just in the past couple of days when, up until a few days ago, you've heard a lot of criticism even coming from the State Department and the White House and pressure on Israel. Look what happened in the past few days. American fighters are bombing Islamic terrorist cells not far away from here, right? And suddenly the pictures you see on TVs of, these black and white airplane shots, you don't even know whether it's ISIS or Hamas. And suddenly
the same with the scenes of destruction in the streets. It's taking place in so many places now.
And the White House has been awfully quiet since then. And Israel has been, bombing Gaza even more so in the past few days. So this is one of the things that, in the Middle East, you have always something happening, usually for the bad. And there's always a surprise. And this is another surprise. And it takes a lot of the pressure out of Israel now. But the question is what's going to happen. And in this respect, I think that the Israeli public is running out of patience. And Israeli leaders are running out of time. Plus, the school year is looming in a few days. And what will you do? Will you send the kids to schools that are targeted by rockets? It's a major problem here. So there's even a chance of escalation, because the pressure on Netanyahu to go for another ground campaign is mounting now. And I don't see any diplomatic efforts really fruitful at this point. I don't see any direction. I don't see anybody sitting with anybody. I don't see the White House at all. And I don't see the Egyptians trying to manage this crisis, in an effective way at this stage. And there's no much in sight, frankly.
Ambassador, do you perhaps see things going in that same direction, that after 6 weeks, a relatively long period of conflict between Israel and Hamas, in the beginning there were intensive efforts, John Kerry jumping around the region, shuttling between Cairo and Israel, Turkey, trying to make things happen, working with the Europeans. As well, we've seen much of the energy, in a way, already spent by the international community on this conflict. Do you believe that that window, in a way, has opened and closed on a level of international interest that will be required? As you mentioned, you think it's important for the international community now to be involved. Has that opportunity already come and gone at some level now, or not?
Opportunities never disappear. They always come back because reality enforces them. Look, Kerry tried. He was shunned by our government and even insulted publicly, even though the way he claims it, we asked him to talk to the Qataris and to the Turks. And then we said that he betrayed us and all that. So I think he had enough of us, and not only because of that, 9 months of negotiations that didn't bring any results were also not more than frustrating for him. So we have to take this into account. Nevertheless, the Americans have an interest of a ceasefire. We have an interest of a ceasefire. The Hamas has it. Everybody has it. So the international community will deal with it again, and I know that they're preparing now a special session of the Security Council, and they will try to bring a European proposal that will connect between the crisis in Gaza at the moment with the conflict, the Mideast conflict in its totality. And that means what probably will happen, we don't know it yet, but what will probably happen is that the Security Council, with American support, will insist on negotiations based on the 67 frontiers. And now, if Israel accepts that, and without American support, Israel cannot really combat it, that will be a major change in the overall diplomatic situation.
And leading somewhere, obviously, greater than just a prolonged ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. So.
At any rate, this will be the starter. But don't forget, Hamas is a real power in the region, a small one, but a real one. It has a government, it has an army, it has armed forces, it has a population, it has a territory, it has internationally recognized frontiers, which neither Mahmoud Abbas nor Israel has. They have it.
Excellent point.
But they have a unity government with Mahmoud Abbas. And if, I think, somebody will happen to get out of this crisis, and as I said, this is a matter of saving face, they will have to give in, because after all, they're also at the end of their energy.
Well, speaking of being at the end of the energies and the sentiments surrounding this conflict now, with me now is Gaza resident Mahana on the phone here, who's joined us previously in many other broadcasts. Maha, thank you again for joining us on this program now. I understand your whereabouts, at least where you're located. It's been difficult for you throughout this conflict now within the Gaza Strip. Tell us today, what's taking place around you, Mahana?
The situation is escalating and it's getting worse day after day. The whole population here live in horror and fear all the time. The school year had to start today, but instead children seek shelter in schools now. People here are interested in long-term ceasefire at the moment and then a lasting peace agreement. They are fed up of the whole situation. They are fed up of losing their homes, their children, everything. They want this war to end very soon.
Now, we're talking about within Israel that the school year is about to begin again for children in a very short time here, just another week or so, in a few days. How is the time of year now becoming a factor for people in Gaza as well? Same considerations?
Again, please?
In terms of the school year beginning very soon within Israel, becoming a more and more serious factor for all the people living under rocket fire in Israel. Are people in Gaza discussing similar issues now as time for the start of school year approaches again? And what are people mainly discussing there?
Yeah, the civilians who have nothing to do with militants or the military factions care about civilians of both sides. When they think, they said, we know that on the other side also they live in shelters all the time, and this will affect them too. But, we need the leaders of both sides just to sit together and settle their differences and find solutions just to ensure that children of both sides can have brighter future. Of course, I'm not measuring the damage of both sides, because There is no way to compare, but people here, the civilians, care about having peace with the other side, and they are fed up losing their children, their homes, and they want a lasting peace agreement. They want to have a life like the rest of humanity.
Well, Ma, as always, we really appreciate your sentiments and your updates coming to us straight out of the Gaza Strip here now. Maha Mahana, take care of yourself there. And now, as a steady stream of rocket fire on Israeli cities continues, as we've mentioned, well, the Israel Defense Force pushes onward with airstrikes on targets across the Gaza Strip, and the images of destruction there are everywhere. Well, after 48 days, it's Gaza civilians who've been caught between Israel and Hamas. Well, Ayman Siksak has more.
2 multi-story apartment buildings were bombed by the IDF in Gaza on Saturday and Sunday, reportedly injuring scores of citizens and pushing the Gaza death toll past 2,100 people. The strikes are said to have been preceded by warning leaflets distributed by the Israeli Air Force.
The last thing we were expecting is that they target a civilian residential tower where there are around 500 to 600 people. They said that they targeted the resistance. There is no resistance here. We are civilians here.
This marks the first time since the launch of Operation Protective Edge that an Israeli military airstrike brought down an entire building, suggesting a worrying new trend by the Israeli Defense Forces. In the airstrikes on Saturday, at least 10 Palestinians were killed, including 4 women and 3 children, in hits on 2 homes in central Gaza Strip.
This is shocking. This is another eviction. It is another eviction of the people of Gaza. We woke up to see this shocking scene.
The 48th day of Operation Protective Edge sees the humanitarian situation in Gaza growing increasingly dire. With electricity and water becoming scarce, residents are forced to transfer continuously between temporary shelters. And as rocket fire from Gaza towards Israel continues, the Palestinian factions insist Israel must end its 8-year blockade of Gaza if a ceasefire is to be reached, while Israeli officials have said they must first have their security needs met in any potential deal. For many citizens of Gaza, however, it may already be too late.
Well, no, Jacob, certainly these are powerful images. There's no shortage of powerful images emerging from the Gaza Strip during this conflict. Dramatic imagery that this is another dimension of the war being fought in the media arena now, no question about it. And it's been this way for a long time in this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. How does the Israeli media specifically, or Israel as a country now in this conflict, deal with this or confront this aspect of the war successfully?
Yeah. Well, you know, over time, it's unfortunate, but people become indifferent to other people's suffering. People are within themselves. Israel has buried a 4-year-old kid today, and you know, people lose their any sense of accepting other people's suffering, and it's very unfortunate. But that's part of the war, and the sentiment within Israel is, you know, we have to finish with this. We have to go to a major showdown with Hamas. You don't see so much of Gazan people suffering on Israeli TV, for example. Not as much. You see much more Israelis suffering from, you know, rockets and so forth, and it's natural in a way, but it brings Israel within itself, and there's no sympathy for others. And as to the world or the world coverage, I see less and less of this as other things catch the attention. You know, over time, you know how it is in media. Over time, you need something new to deal with. So now there's ISIS, and now there's the beheading of the journalist of Foley, and I don't know, there's an earthquake on the West Coast today,
California,
right?
that's
Who
right.
knows? So things over time, you'll see less and less of this, unfortunately, and. But that does not mean that, you know, things are getting better in any way. They're getting worse.
Professor Navon, do you think that Israel's managed this round of media conflict properly in this, or at least in the best way that they that they could in this form of conflict? Obviously, and actually, the execution of Foley, the American journalist there, I think speaks to a new reality taking place across all conflicts in the world, that the journalists aren't as required as they once were and valued by all sides as they once were to tell that story to the world, where, for example, ISIS, they don't need foreign journalists to come in now. They can go to the social media websites. They upload their own footage. They show their own pictures of what's taking place. And as that has increased, as the world has become more and more exposed to these conflicts, and Israel has been a great case study of that from year to year, leading to today, where images are everywhere now of what's taking place in Gaza. How does that present itself as a new challenge? How has the government been dealing with that shifting challenge?
Well, you know, I don't know if you follow my column on the I-24 News, but I wrote about this this week, and I said, you know, two centuries ago, David Hume spoke about the theory of concentric circles, saying that you always worry more about the pain that touches you than the one that is far away. What happened with modern telecommunications, with cable television and the internet, is that we see everything all the time. So the fact that things are far away doesn't mean that we don't see and feel them. However, there is still a very selective way of feeling empathy for other people. Because when you see the demonstrations today in Europe, for example, against Israel for the operation in Gaza, and the complete absence of such demonstration for the much worse massacres in Syria or in Iraq, it does show that there is still a selective empathy in the world, not based on how far you are, but based on who is actually killing you, which is really interesting.
Mosul, it's the first time in 1,200 years where there's no Catholic Mass in the city of Mosul in Iraq, but no protests on the street. You're right.
Well, you know, in 2009, at the end of Operation Cast Lead, there was this international condemnation of Israel. There was the Goldstone report. At the very same time, the government of Sri Lanka killed 40,000 Tamils. Nobody talked about it. The Human Rights Council did set up a commission, but it's still debating. It hasn't reached any conclusion 5 years after the massacre. So, yes, there is still a very selective empathy in the world, as I said, not based on how far you are, but based on who is actually fighting you.
If you're part of the family or you're not. If you're part of the family, you are criticized for much more than if you're a total foreigner like Sri Lanka. But when France fought in Algeria, America in Vietnam, when the Greeks had their colonels on top of their government, the Western world was up in arms. When it was Idi Amin or Bokassa, nobody cared. Because you're part of the family, and this is a advantage and a disadvantage for us. We are considered as part of the civilized world, of the civilized families.
You know, when on the streets of Paris, people scream in Arabic, "Idbah al-Yahud," I don't think they feel that we're part of their family.
I don't think anyone has any sympathy for them. I don't think anyone in the Western world has any sympathy for the Hamas. None whatsoever. This is our advantage in this struggle for public opinion. But on the other hand, to answer your question, if you see the pictures, which we Israelis don't see, not just of destructions, if you see the bodies of kids, of children, which the world televisions show and we don't show, this has an influence. But again, as I said, our advantage is that nobody really likes the Hamas, and this is an understatement.
I just wanted to say that some major chunks of Israeli society a long time ago decided to divorce from the family. And they don't care about the world opinion.
That's a big problem for us.
It is a growing trend of not isolationism necessarily, but the idea that we can't put up with this anymore. Definitely, yes, you'd think that's not a good trend by the Israeli society, especially for a small country that essentially is an island.
There's one thing we have to say in the entire complex of this problem. We are not capable. We are simply not capable of reconquering the Gaza Strip. All this talk about Gaza Strip, we'll go in and we'll destroy the Hamas. We are not capable.
Thank you very much.
We're not capable? For the same reason that America couldn't win one single war since the Second World War.
Ambassador Pimon,
that's the reason.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jacob Elon, and of course Professor Levon.
But we don't have time to discuss.
No time. Thank you. We'll be back again after a short break.
שהטרוריסטים הבזים לדם ילדיהם לא יחוסו על דם ילדינו.
איננו ממהרים לשום מקום, יש לנו סבלנות, יש לנו אורך נשימה.
ليس هناك ما تخشاه المقاومة الفلسطينية التي تمارس مقاومة مشروعة مارستها كل الشعوب التي تعرضت للاحتلال.
חמאס משלם ועוד ישלם מחירים כבדים על הפשעים הללו שהוא מבצע.
Welcome back to our special edition here on I-24 News. I'm now joined in the studio by Dr. Anat Ochberg-Marom, an expert on global terrorism, Iranian politics lecturer, Mayo Javedan Far, and defense and government analyst for Haaretz, Amir Oren. Thank you all for joining us here, and welcome back. We start now start by opening the session, speaking about a certain incident that took place on Friday. Now, Israel experienced its first child casualty since the current conflict began. Well, the death added fuel to the fire in the south, where residents are now increasingly angry at the constant rocket fire and the lack of any perceivable solution. Well, I-24 News correspondent Charles B. Blazer went to Nahal Oz, the small community where 4-year-old Daniel Tregerman was laid to rest.
An immense tragedy laid bare as 4-year-old Daniel Tregerman was laid to rest on Sunday. Killed 2 days earlier when a mortar shell struck the Nahal Oz kibbutz, the agony felt by his family was palpable.
My dear Daniel, I don't understand what is going on here at all. I can't believe I'm here at the cemetery. You are the love of my life, perfect child, smart, sensitive, always mature for your age, beautiful, so beautiful. I'm trying to understand, and I can't. We were the happiest family in the world. You were born and there was joy at home. A year later, little Ori came into our lives as well. My Daniel, we want to say thank you. Thank you that you taught us to love. You taught us to be parents. You taught us to smile. You gave us many moments of joy and pride in such a short time period.
This was a small affair, unlike previous funerals held for lone soldiers, for example, which were attended by tens of thousands. In this remote region of Israel's south, it is still not safe for masses to congregate. But Israeli President Reuven Rivlin did make an unannounced visit in a show of solidarity, although eyebrows were raised by the total absence of elected government officials.
We lost you, Daniel. Precious Daniel. We were so afraid from this moment. We saw pictures of destroyed children's homes, classrooms with damaged tables, and playgrounds that were hit by mortar shells. We saw children's games that were damaged and empty swimming pools.
But after nearly 7 weeks of war, the region remains a veritable danger zone. Before the funeral even began, we were told on 4 separate occasions that should a code red alert sound, we would have only 15 seconds, if that, to find shelter. Even the deepest of sorrows provides no escape from reality, which is fueling frustration, if not outright anger, amongst Israeli Southerners.
Between the military road and the diplomatic one, for 14 years now, Daniel is paying the price. He stays now in the sky with the football shirt of the Argentinian national team, finds friends there to play football, kick the ball, run, score the goal, beat the bad people.
After an emotional, if not tragic day, I'm standing just a few feet away from where 4-year-old Daniel Tregerman was buried. While we were here during the ceremony, we heard multiple audible explosions nearby, reminding us that the South still remains a place of danger and that after nearly 7 weeks of Operation Protective Edge, the rockets continue to fly, each one representing, unfortunately, another potential tragedy right around the corner.
Well, now this being an extreme example of the greater concept of the strategy that Hamas has employed throughout this conflict now, targeting with thousands of rockets the Israeli civilian infrastructure and home front, and unfortunately succeeding on a certain level now by killing this small child in Israel. We've seen the comparisons drawn by Prime Minister Netanyahu this last week between Hamas and ISIS, the militants now rampaging through much of northern Iraq and Syria, also killing innocents along the path as they go. How do you see this comparison now in light of such tangible results of the strategy within Israel and the strategy being employed across the region? Are there similarities here that are relevant for this conflict?
Actually, there are similarities, but a lot of differences between it. We have to be very cautious when we do the comparison between Hamas and the IS. Period. It's the power of language, the power of words could kill. So we have to be cautious in what we do and why we compare it, because it's between the local jihad, which is the Hamas, against Israel, as compared to the global jihad, which is the IS against the West, for most of the US. The global jihad ideology is a lot more extreme as compared to the charter that was founded by Hamas at 1988. It's absolutely different when we speak about Hamas. The target Israel, the target the Israelis, the Jew entity, the Israel all over. They see the PLO and Abu Mazen as their enemy. Inside some very, let's say, territorial limits over here, as compared to the IS, which are boundless, borderless. They have stateless entity, which is called the Islamic collective Ummah or the Islamic Caliphate. There is no borders. They have no limits. They could kill whoever they want to, including their Sunnah, their Muslims.
Now, we've seen that mass executions taking
right.
place, especially of minorities.
Mass killing, beheading, crucifying. It is not let's say, the language of the Hamas. We have to be very cautious here. Even give like a kind of recognition or even legitimacy, I would say it very cautiously also, to the Hamas. We should not use these words to compare between them.
Well, we've seen our Prime Minister Netanyahu now drawing these comparisons as clear as possible now. Not, one could say, not being too cautious about drawing this parallel or too cautious about his words. The clear line drawn between these two. Now, they're both attacking civilians. They're both maybe have a different short-term enemy. Do you see that as an appropriate parallel drawn by the Prime Minister, or why did he do that now?
Unfortunately, it's neither an appropriate comparison nor a useful one. And apparently the speaker in Netanyahu and even the old ambassador to the UN got the better of the decision-maker Netanyahu, because the same Hamas is on speaking terms with Israel, indirectly through other interlocutors, but nevertheless, this is not the case with the US and the IS. The US is striking IS targets from the air near Mosul and Erbil in Iraq, and is not trying to placate them and find some common ground. But Israel is trying to find something which will give concessions, at least to the Palestinian people, represented by another Palestinian group, by Fatah or by the Palestinian Authority headed by Mahmoud Abbas. So if Netanyahu is sincere in saying that Hamas is IS, it would mean that he is breaking off all contacts with Hamas and is trying to wage all-out war with them, which is not the case.
What about the purpose of drawing in more international support or Western support for the fight against Hamas? Do you think there's some purpose served there then by it saying, hey, we're all in the same fight together? You're fighting something called ISIS, we're fighting Hamas, but it's all one and the same. Is there something that was gained or to be gained from that strategy?
Yes, of course, it's aimed at that, at public opinion, at garnering a soundbite. But this is good for one nightly edition of television news. And please don't be offended. Television news is great. But nevertheless, the misery of the Palestinians in Gaza is there. It is not going to go away just because people watching television will tell themselves, Mr. Netanyahu is correct. Hamas is IS. Okay, so what? Where do we go from here? So back to the negotiating table, and eventually some concessions will be found that Hamas will accept, and that Israel will give to Mahmoud Abbas and to the Egyptians, and we will have some way out of this conflict, of this confrontation, and people will forget this comparison.
Mayor, we'll be back with you in just a moment, but staying on the line here, speaking about ISIS now, well, the Israeli Prime Minister now continues to stress this comparison that we've mentioned between Hamas and the now notorious Sunni militant group, the Islamic State. Well, Hamas leader Khaled Mashal even went as far as to dismiss those allegations. Well, I-24 News reporter Ori Shapiro takes a closer look at the two militant Islamic movements.
In recent days, one message is dominating Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's agenda.
Hamas is ISIS. ISIS is like Hamas. Just as you wouldn't put America and ISIS on the same moral plane, you'd never put Israel and Hamas on the same moral plane.
Even when there is no proven connection between the Palestinian Islamic Organization and the Islamic State militant group, it is tempting to compare these two groups who have both captured the world attention. Since its establishment in the late 1980s, Hamas's military wing has carried out hundreds of terror attacks, which killed hundreds of Israeli civilians. Photographs of the execution of the 18 alleged collaborators in Gaza by Hamas militants last Friday came only a few days after the terrifying pictures of beheaded journalist James Foley were released by the Islamic State. The comparison was inevitable. Hamas officials apparently recognized this dangerous trend. The group's political leader Khaled Mashal told Yahoo News Saturday not to compare Hamas to IS, saying, "We are not terrorists, Israel is." In another interview, Mashal continued his attempts to tag Hamas as a legitimate political movement.
Negotiations between enemies are realistic and logical when the other party is looking for peace.
Mashal and his friends are trying to defer themselves from the notorious Sunni group wreaking havoc in Syria and Iraq. As opposed to the Islamic State, Hamas sees itself as a Palestinian liberation movement which mainly acts in Gaza and the West Bank. Perhaps the debate over the Hamas's true nature is more rhetorical than a real. But as long as it serves both sides, the battle continues.
Well, now, Mayor, we've seen another development overnight here now, connected potentially to this. I want to hear your opinion on this. Speaking about ISIS now, certainly redrawing allegiances somewhat in the region, or making perhaps unlikely allies out of certain parties, while it seems to be a constant shifting of sands around the region right now in terms of who's on whose side and whatnot. But Iran certainly faced off against ISIS strongly, as ISIS charging southward in Iraq, claiming to destroy all the Shiite holy places that exist. And this is a direct confrontation with the regime in Iran. Well, last night, rockets were fired out of Syria and Lebanon towards Israel now. Some speculate at the command of Iran now as a way to complicate the situation here as well. Where does Iran sit in this whole complicated equation now, in reference to the conflict between Israel, and Hamas, and with everything else that some have drawn parallels to?
The Iranians, compared to the other conflicts, they have reduced their support for Hamas because Hamas turned against Iran in Syria. And Iran was
in Syria, a long-time patron of Hamas there.
Iran, according to The Guardian, was supplying Hamas to the tune of $25 million a month, which comes to something like $300 million a year for a number of years. And then in Syria, it all fell apart. Iran was supplying weapons to Hamas after that, but Hamas took the weapons on the condition that they don't have to have any political relations with Iran. But now, after the fall of Morsi, it's been very difficult for Iran to get weapons through to Hamas because, al-Sisi has ended the chaos in
the highway of tunnels that came out of the Sinai.
And Mashal wanted to go to Tehran at some stage, and the Iranians said no. Even in in one of the most popular news site in Iran, Tabnak, which is owned by the former IRGC Revolutionary Guard commander, they called him a charlatan. Just think about it. An Iranian newspaper belonged to a former head of the Revolutionary Guard. They called Mashal charlatan. The Iranians have felt very badly burned out by Hamas, what it did in Syria. But I think after they see that Hamas is being drawn Israel into a war of what's now 48 days, I think it is possible that the attractiveness of Hamas is going to increase.
In other words, does the animosity from the Iranian regime towards Israel outweigh the other complications between Hamas and Iran? Is this more important of a strategic goal for them to strengthen anyone who's fighting Israel? In other words, put their differences aside for the sake of fighting Israel?
Now it could be, but now there's another somebody else in this relationship who's not going to like it, and that's Qatar. Remember that the Qataris are financing Hamas. The Qataris just ordered $11 billion worth of weapons. And I think it's safe to assume that some of it is to defend themselves against Iran, because they don't like Iran becoming too strong in the Persian Gulf region. And I call it the Persian Gulf, and they call it the Arabian Gulf. And there's discussions over gas. We can go on. So it's not going to be so easy for Iran and Hamas to get together, because now there's somebody else in the relationship. But I think the Iranians will now try their best. What I have to say is that there was another news last night that Iranian forces had crossed the border into Iraq, carried out joint operations with the Kurdish Peshmerga against ISIS last week. And on Saturday, they withdrew their forces. Now, Iran's sending ground forces across the border to attack a city in the province of Diyala, if I'm not mistaken, which is close to the Iranian border. That shows that Iran is very concerned about ISIS. And I think now that ISIS is just today took an important strategic airport in Syria, I think the Iranians are going to become even more worried.
Not the first time that Iran has shown their willingness to insert ground personnel.
Not this quantity. Apparently the quantity before, it was a number of special forces, but I don't know. The way the Al Jazeera article described it, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was in the thousands, even though it didn't say it.
Yes, Amir.
In international events, obviously you have alphabetically Iran, Iraq, Israel.
Right.
And then Italy and other countries. And there were shifting alliances among those throughout the years. There need be no permanent hostility between Iran and Israel.
Certainly history has shown relations can definitely change.
Yes, and Israel was condemned, and of course Americans speak volumes about it. Israel was condemned because it was an ally of the Shah. When the revolution deposed the Shah, Israel was on the side of the negative. And of course, when it invaded Lebanon, Iran helped the Shiites under Amal and especially Hezbollah. This is 35 years old. And alliances do shift, and now there are converging interests which make Israel and Iran at least de facto allies on some sectors of the front, not the nuclear issue, of course.
Fascinating concepts there.
And I want to continue here, because we can have it in a broad and more geostrategic perspective to look at, because we can have a window of opportunity for Israel specifically, if we take also into account the Saudi Arabia interests, which are one of the uniqueness time that we can have it over here, which could be great for Israel if we can do lead for any further, proceed with this alliance.
If you're willing to stop building 400 homes in the West Bank and stop annoying 500 million Arabs, then I think, yes, if the government wakes up and becomes a little bit wiser, then I think
the window's open for greater engagement in the Arab world for Israel.
Right.
The Saudis, sorry for interrupting, the Saudis want to have peace with us. They've recognized us. They were saying they reach a deal with Mahmoud Abbas. Now, Amir knows this better than you know this better than... But the thing is, we look at everything else that happens in the region. We say, why is it that the Iranians are crippling their economy over 10,000 centrifuges? And, why are we crippling ourselves diplomatically in this region for the sake of building 500 homes? The region is changing, and it's changing for the better for Israel, and we are the ones who need to adapt and change, because we could become leaders in this region.
And the key piece in the puzzle is Egypt. Because of the long-term relationship between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and because under Sisi there is a new look in Egyptian foreign and security policy, Egypt is now the only player able to extricate Israel from this Gaza mess. It is holding all the cards, obviously, regarding the Rafah crossing, but not only that.
And a country who can speak openly and have open relations with Israel.
Yes, and Israel is going to have to pay a price. And we should all remember that when Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem, he didn't want a separate peace with Israel. He wanted the Palestinian issue mentioned there. It started with the autonomy talks and later turned into what we have now. And President Sisi would also demand some sort of return to the Camp David principles, and Israel will have to negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas, and it is good that Egypt will lend its good officers for that.
Let's phrase it, let's say like windows of opportunity is not only the Saudi Arabia, it's also Egypt as well. And put it in a new frame, like saying it's not the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, as the Faisal in Saudi Arabia said so, but between Israel and Turkey and Iran. But if we take the Iran out of this context and we say against Turkey, so Turkey is the outsider. If we take the players over here, it could be something that might be very interesting in the near future to see how Sisi is going up, how Faisal in Saudi Arabia a little bit going down, but it could be the average over here, and Turkey is outside, which could be very useful for Israel if we compare it against Hamas.
And Turkey also threatened from the ISIS forces. In fact, today, some threats issued towards Turkey, I think it was.
Right. There were some.
I'd like to ask, coming back to Iran now for a moment. So another development here, Iran, the claims about downing the Israeli drone. How significant is that story, or accurate is that story?
You never know with these things. Sometimes it sounds like, okay, they just, because you remember the time when they had a missile maneuver and they published the pictures and it turned out later that they photoshopped a number of them. So it could be completely nonsense, or it could be that maybe they did. You never know with these things.
But the timing is relevant, no? Why
again,
now? Why put that story out now?
Well, we have to wait and see. If it's false, then you could say, well, today Iran said that it has unveiled a number of new missiles and drones, that perhaps it could be trying to milk the situation. But if it turns out that it was true, then we have to ask ourselves, why were we doing what we were doing? I think on this, I urge caution. I would say if we have to go by previous statements by Iran, there's room for skepticism, great room for skepticism, but with these things you never know.
We'll come back to this discussion in just a moment, but let's see a report here now, somewhat on this topic, about the Iranian capabilities.
The Fotros is Iran's biggest domestically developed drone, and its unveiling is the peak of continued efforts by the Aviation Industries Organization of the Iranian Armed Forces. The drone can be used for reconnaissance and surveillance, and once armed with air-to-surface missiles or other types of rockets, has the potential to carry out combat operations. Iran unveiled its first domestically manufactured long-range combat drone, the Karar, 3 years ago. It reportedly has an operational radius of 1,000 kilometers and can carry 2 bombs or precision-guided munitions. The first Iranian medium-altitude long-endurance UAV, the Shahed 129, was unveiled in September 2012. It's capable of carrying out combat and reconnaissance missions for 24 hours. In the meantime, Iran's protege from Lebanon, Hezbollah, has tried to operate drones against Israel. The first launch of the Ababil drone took place during the Second Lebanon War and was intercepted by jet fighters of the Israeli Air Force. Another attempt took place in October 2012. 2 Israeli F-16 fighter jets shut down a drone that flew above the southern skies of Israel. Hezbollah head Hassan Nasrallah took responsibility and claimed that prior to its shutdown, the drone had managed to fly over some IDF bases.
Well, now, Amir, we've seen this story now. Let's face it, the drone industry isn't what it was maybe 5 years ago or longer, where it was really a specialized tool in the arsenal of many top-tier nations. Now we've seen drones built in the Gaza Strip being employed in this conflict now. So, in your opinion, how significant is this announcement now by Iran? What does it mean?
Well, drones were started to be perfected by the U.S. military back in the 60s, first as targets for jet fighters. And then Israel was the first country to have experimented wisdom regarding reconnaissance over the Suez Canal even before the Yom Kippur War. And now it is, of course, a thriving industry because nobody wants to see a pilot captured or killed in combat. And also, as the report mentioned, the drone can loiter for 24 hours.
It's been used in many targeted killings by the U.S. and by Israel.
Right.
As well.
And Israel has never admitted that it has armed RPVs, but it is widely believed that it is employing them. Now, regarding the Iranian story, true or false, it is a very positive story, because it means that the Iranians believe that Israel is spying on them. Why is it positive? Because if Iran perceives Israel to have penetrated it, be it by spies, by cyber, by drones, it means that it assesses that its capability is now transparent to Israel. And in international relations, transparency is good. The KGB and the CIA during the Cold War were forces for good because they knew what was happening on the other side.
Can I just
yes,
point
no,
out? We
absolutely.
have to, after the recent agreement between Iran and the P5+1, which was signed on November 25th, 2013, according to the new agreement, there are visitors by the IAEA on foot to Natanz every day.
The nuclear inspectors.
Yes, nuclear inspectors to the enrichment site in Natanz. Now, I ask myself the question, why would Israel want to fly over these things when there's people visiting those sites on foot, human brain being the most sophisticated radar system anywhere? Again, that adds more credibility to being skeptic. But
no, there is a benefit, and even the municipality here does it. If you do it periodically, you see the changes. The municipality here wants to see whether you added a room to your rooftop. So every 3 weeks or so, it has a picture of your rooftop. And if Israel took a picture of Natanz a month ago, last year, and it sees no change, again, this is positive news.
Well, interesting aspect I think you raised, Amir, about it. It's speaking to what the Iranians may assume are the Israeli capabilities here in the region. Do you see it in a similar way here? That, in other words, it's an admission that we've been infiltrated by the Israelis. Whether or not it's true or not, there is an intriguing side note to the story there, looking at it like that. Do you think that that's being picked up on by other regional powers now, other countries? The Islamic State militants, for example, are they paying attention to a story like this from Iran?
I do think that there are some symbols that they can, just use as kind of their imagination. I wouldn't go that long. I mean, depends. Time will tell us.
A lot of accusations get leveled back and forth throughout the pages of this.
But if you add it to the targeted killings, and if in the region it is noted that Israeli intelligence managed to find out where Mohammed Def was in Gaza and where the other senior Hamas leaders were, and operationalize its actions so that it hit them. Whether Def was killed or not is not yet known, but the other three leaders, and today there was a fourth one, that means that Israeli intelligence is still, if not revered, held in high esteem in the region.
We'll come back again to our discussion now. Our correspondent Eli Ochenberg is standing by in the south of Israel, in Ashkelon, the Israeli coastal city here that, again, has been one of the epicenters here now of rocket fire, on the receiving end of much rocket fire from the Gaza Strip here now, as recently as this evening, Eli. Now, despite a rocket directly hitting a home here just earlier this evening, it looks that people are out and about in the streets, out dining in the street and driving around. Everything seems to be going on as normal, Ellie. Is that right?
Yes, David. Well, it was a crazy summer, and most of the southern residents, especially in the big cities, began to get used to this situation where they have to balance a normal life routine and this crazy reality where missile just keeps on coming towards the city and the entire area. And indeed, we had direct hits this evening on 2 different buildings in the city of Ashkelon. Thank God it's only property damage, no injuries. But as we've seen seen in the last days, the missile threat is back on, and the residents here needs to adapt yet again the state of mind of wartime, and of course to protect themselves according to all the orders of the Home Front Command. But again, the issue of balancing between the normal life routine and the fact that this is wartime is not an easy task, especially when next week the school year should start, and the children and parents, of course, are very confused with what is going to happen. Just let me describe it to you. 700 pupils in a school, and the red siren alerts strike the area yet again. It's not an easy situation to handle, and all of these questions and much more will have to be given an answer by the political level, and the residents here are looking forward to hear the instructions for the upcoming days. But yet again, we're summarizing a very intensive day after following a very intensive weekend of rocket fire, and another tense evening here. But as you can see behind me, people are trying to remain sane and still going out and wandering in the streets. This is the crazy reality of Israel in the last
certainly
2 months,
speaks
David.
to the resilience of the Israeli home front, no question there. Eli Ochenberg, our correspondent in Ashkelon, thank you for the report. Well, now, refocusing the conversation somewhat on regional issues now, international issues, and the Islamic State militants, as they've moved and gained momentum, gained power, gained following now. And again, we started out this discussion talking about the parallels that have been drawn by the Israeli prime ministers, most recently, between Hamas and ISIS militants. Now, ISIS was taking some flack, at least from certain places in the region that are from Hamas, from the Palestinians, that they weren't supporting openly, making statements or supporting Hamas in their struggle against Israel enough. And some statements came out of them to the effect that, well, that's a long-term goal, is to join them in the fight against Israel, that someday ISIS will be involved in the fight against Israel. But how is the Western world, specifically Europeans most specifically, where many ISIS fighters have come from, some say thousands now, how are they dealing with this growing challenge now? You hear the words of the leaders calling this, well, there's no place for this in the 21st century, it's medieval, it's many of these claims, but the reality is it is a modern creation, the Islamic State. It is existing and thriving in our modern world. How is the West facing off against this threat?
I would say, first of all, we have to be very accurate. Hamas, for the ISIS, is a foe, it's the enemy, because Hamas is dealing with Israel, with the PLO. They're just involved in a very in election process, in something that smells and have some Western values, which means democracy and nationalism, and so on and so on. On the other hand, when you're speaking about European, I would say that like the sit and wait policy should be in an alert, in a wake-up call from here and from anywhere, because there is no time for waiting anymore. This is going to be like the big threat is already here, not only against Israel, but the Western world. So if we want to cope with and to deal with, but a lot for to confront the ISIS and the global jihad threat, we do have to be in alert and to do lots of stuff. European sit-and-wait policy is no longer the way to cope with.
Is there a historical comparison, at least any recent historical comparison to the momentum, to what the Islamic State militants are achieving today in terms of the growing popularity and actually starting to control territory, maybe undefined to some degree, but controlling territory, large pieces of it?
They have lots of achievements, either financial, militarily, and politically. They influence public opinion all over the world. It's a new existing threat. It's a burden to all of us in the Western world. We should do something, and to be, again, I said, not to be passive. To be passive is our, we will be knocked out by the next coming threat, and it's no longer. It's not enough to say that we have to do something. We do have to confront with, and we have some very creative strategies and warfare, marketing strategy for warfare that we will use against the narratives of ISIS.
David, in the old world order, capitals and regimes were all important. It turns out that ungoverned territories or tribal territories, which the central government thought little of, have become much more important because they were the hotbeds of radicalism, of movements such as Al-Qaeda, out of which, one offshoot of which is Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, which became the Islamic State, and compared to which mainstream Al-Qaeda looks conservative. And if you look at Syria today, and it all started with the problem in Syria, you have President Assad, who looks even gentlemanly compared to Al-Qaeda. Then you have Hezbollah coming from Lebanon to help Assad. Then you have Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the sort of mainstream Al-Qaeda. And you have, as their rival, the Islamic State. So who are you going to support among all of these evils?
Well, certainly interesting how the face of the enemy has shifted so much over the recent years here. Mayor, I want to put this towards you more on the Shiite perspective of what's taking place. Many have argued that the phenomena of ISIS now and the momentum that they've gained is a product of the oppression of the Shiites for many years now, for some would say since the Americans put them in power in Iraq and they began oppressive policies, that less of a Sunni revolution is taking place and more of a Sunni revolt against the Shiite powers in the region, Iran and now the central government in Baghdad now. Is that accurate, or is there another way to explain in the framework of Shiite Sunni relations why this is taking place?
I think there's a number of factors. I think partly is one of the factors responsible for what's going on now is because of Nouri al-Maliki and what he did to the Sunnis in Iraq. I mean, as soon as he was elected, he drove out Tariq al-Hashemi, who was the Sunni vice president. He started going after Sunnis. Of course, we know that there's been ethnic cleansing of Sunnis in Baghdad. Baghdad used to have a much larger Sunni population. So yes, partially, absolutely, Iran is responsible. But the other side, we have to look at also where does ISIS come from? ISIS comes from Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, who supported Al-Qaeda? A lot of the Sunni states from the Persian Gulf, including some of the Saudi families. I think there's a mixture of reasons that go into this, which is what makes the solution very hard. However, I have to say that there is a little glimmer of hope here, although I emphasize the word glimmer. There's a new Iraqi government. They've promised to work with the Sunnis. Of course, as soon as they said that, some Shiite extremists went into a Sunni mosque and gunned down 76 Sunnis. But again, Al-Abadi, the new Iraqi president, has promised that he's going to work with the Sunnis, and some Sunni tribes have said that if the government pays attention to them, they will turn against ISIS. So, it is possible that we may see something, that the situation is going to be reversible. How much, it's extremely difficult to say. In terms of the European issue, if I may add one point, according to, there was a number I saw that in the entire 8-year war between the Mujahideen and the Soviet army in Afghanistan, in total, there were 10,000 foreign fighters in total over the years. Right now, there's 12,000 foreign fighters in ISIS, and a lot of them are from Europe and other countries. This is another issue which is very concerning, and you have to ask yourself, apart from anti-terror operations and trying to strengthen the Sunnis, what are the European countries going to do to make sure that the Muslim communities are amalgamated, are accepted into the society, so that young Muslim men from Britain and from France don't decide that they have to go to jihad in order to prove themselves.
A young boy.
It's the American notion of nation building only repeats the mistake that the British imposed on the region for their own imperial interests a century ago, when they went to Mesopotamia and created the new artificial nation of Iraq out of sectarian parts, Kurdish, Sunni, Shiites, which really didn't have a lot to do with each other and are still fighting. And when the Americans went there to topple Saddam Hussein, they deluded themselves into believing that they can have a national government, a national army, a national police. They will train them, and when they leave,
bringing in the Western
this will be the melting pot for a pluribus unum some from many. One, just like America,
to the rest of the
America
region.
in the Middle East. What's so difficult about it?
I would also say that in a vastly changing environment, we should give a lot of attention to what's going on in the internet, in the online, all the social networks, which the radicalization is coming from there. They don't need the mosque and all over and the madrasa. They needed the only taken from the internet, which is a threat to everybody, not only to the Western world, but also in here, the Middle East. But specifically, for example, what I wanted to give before is the 13 years old boy that was from Belgium, that was taken or escaped to Syria. He is only one sample out of thousands of people that go there, but he is 13. He is a boy. I mean, what's going on here? He is going to be the next coming fighter jihad, where we will be tomorrow. I mean,
and it seems for now the Western governments are grappling with how to even explain or even understand exactly how wide this phenomena is within their societies.
And the why question is the most important here.
It's kind of just
well, we unfortunately are out of time. Appreciate all of our guests here. Dr. Anat Okbog-Marom, thank you very much. Amir Oren and Meir Javadan Fall, thank you all for joining us on our special edition here, day 48 of Operation Protective Edge now, as Israel battles Hamas militants now in the Gaza Strip and around it. Well, thank you for joining us here. I'm David Matlin, coming to you from the Jaffa Port in Israel. That's all.